Before we begin, if you're enjoying this content, please use those hype points on the video. It helps this channel more than you could possibly know. If you're listening on Spotify, leaving a review makes a massive difference for us. And if you feel like it, drop a comment letting us know what time it is where you are and where in the world you're tuning in from. We absolutely love seeing where everyone is listening. If this is your kind of content, please consider subscribing. It keeps us going. And a huge thank you to Dogface680 for suggesting this story. This one's fascinating. The man who closed his eyes and saw everything. There's a photograph you can still find today. Black and white. Slightly faded. It shows a man lying on a couch, hands folded across his chest, eyes closed. Peaceful. Almost serene. You'd think he was napping. But according to the stenographer seated beside him, pen moving rapidly across the page, this man was about to diagnose a stranger's illness. From hundreds of miles away, without meeting them, without medical training, without even being conscious. His name was Edgar Cayce, and for more than 40 years people came to him with questions he shouldn't have been able to answer. Some called him a prophet, others called him a fraud. But no one could explain how a man with an 8th grade education could describe complex medical procedures in perfect anatomical detail while sound asleep, or how he spoke about ancient civilizations that mainstream archaeology insists never existed, or why, decades after his death, the things he predicted keep surfacing in ways that make people very uncomfortable. This isn't a story about belief. It's a story about a man who claimed to access knowledge from somewhere else, and the possibility that what he found was never meant to be recovered. The question isn't whether you believe Edgar Cayce. The question is whether you're ready to consider that everything we think we know about human consciousness, ancient history, and the nature of knowledge itself might be incomplete. Chapter 1. The Boy Who Fell Asleep to Learn. Edgar Cayce was born on March 18th, 1877, in Hopkinsville, Kentucky. Rural America. Farmland stretching as far as you could see. Church on Sundays. School in a one-room building. Nothing unusual, except Edgar. His parents, Leslie and Carrie Cayce, were farmers. Religious people, Methodists. They believed in hard work, scripture, and the value of education even if formal schooling was limited in their community. Edgar was the eldest of 5 children. Quiet, thoughtful, the kind of boy who spent more time alone than with other children his age. As a child, he told his parents he could see people no one else could see. Not shadows, not imaginary friends. Full conversations with figures he described in perfect detail. He spoke about his grandfather, Thomas Jefferson Cayce, who had died the year before Edgar was born. He recounted stories about the man that no one had told him. Details about Thomas's life, his habits, things he used to say. His mother listened, didn't dismiss it, didn't encourage it either. His family was religious, so they didn't automatically reject the possibility of spiritual experiences, but they didn't talk about it much outside the home either. This was rural Kentucky in the 1880s. Strange abilities didn't make you famous, they made you different. And different was dangerous. But the visions continued. Edgar described playing with children in the woods near their farm, children his mother couldn't see. He said they had wings, that they told him things, comforted him when he was sad. His parents called them angels. Edgar called them friends. Then came the books. Edgar struggled in school. Reading was hard. Memorization was harder. He could sit with a spelling book for hours and barely retain a handful of words. His teachers grew frustrated. His father grew angry. One night, after failing yet another spelling test, Edgar's father kept him up late drilling the words, over and over, but nothing stuck. Edgar was exhausted, frustrated, close to tears. Finally, he asked his father if he could rest for just a few minutes. His father, exasperated, agreed. Edgar took his spelling book, placed it under his pillow and fell asleep. When he woke up 30 minutes later, he knew every word. Not just the ones he'd studied. All of them. Every word in the entire book. His father didn't believe it at first. He tested Edgar, made him spell words backward, asked him to recite pages by number. Edgar did it all, perfectly. His father stared at him, half amazed, half unnerved. They tried it again the next night with a different book, same result. Edgar absorbed the entire contents, not through study, through sleep. His teacher noticed the change immediately. The boy who could barely read was suddenly reciting lessons with perfect accuracy. She asked Edgar how he'd done it, told her the truth. She didn't believe him, thought he'd found some way to cheat. But there was no explanation for how he could answer questions about material that hadn't even been covered in class yet. Word spread through the small community. The boy who learned by sleeping, the boy who saw angels, the boy who knew things he shouldn't know. Local preachers came to the house. Some called it a gift from God. Others warned of demonic influence. Edgar's parents didn't know what to think. But they made a decision. They told Edgar to keep it quiet. Use the ability for school if it helped. But don't talk about it. Don't draw attention. Because in a small town, being different wasn't just unusual. It was dangerous. No profit motive yet. No publicity. No fame. Just a child in a small town displaying abilities no one could explain, and everyone was slightly afraid of. Chapter 2. The sleeping readings begin. Edgar grew up. The visions faded. The learning tricks stopped working around. Adolescence. Whatever door had been open seemed to close. He left school after 8th grade. Not unusual for the time. Most children in rural areas didn't pursue higher education. They worked, helped their families, started their own lives. Edgar became a photographer. He had a talent for it, an eye for composition. He opened a studio, got married to a woman named Gertrude Evans in June of 1903. They had a son. Life was normal, quiet, exactly what Edgar wanted. Then his voice disappeared. In 1900, Edgar developed a severe case of laryngitis. It came on suddenly. One day he was fine. The next he could barely whisper. Doctors examined him. Found nothing wrong physically, no infection, no blockage, no damage to his vocal cords. But his voice was gone. Specialists tried everything. Medicines, therapies, sprays. Nothing worked. Weeks turned into months. Edgar's photography career was over. You can't run a studio if you can't speak to clients. Gertrude watched her husband sink into depression. They had bills, a child, no income. Then a man named Hart came to town. Hart was a travelling hypnotist, part entertainer, part therapist. He'd heard about Edgar's condition and offered to try something experimental. Hypnosis. Edgar was sceptical, but desperate. He agreed. Hart put Edgar into a trance, and while Edgar was under, something remarkable happened. His voice came back, strong, clear, normal. Hart asked Edgar questions. Edgar answered in full sentences. No whisper, no strain. But the moment Hart brought Edgar out of the trance, the voice disappeared again. They tried multiple sessions, same result every time. Edgar could speak normally while hypnotized. But the second he woke up, the whisper returned. Hart suggested something radical. What if Edgar didn't need someone else to hypnotize him? What if he could put himself into the trance? And what if, while in that state, he could diagnose his own condition? Edgar was willing to try anything. He lay down on a couch in Hart's office, closed his eyes, focused on his breathing, let his mind drift. Within minutes, he was under. Hart asked him a question. "What's wrong with your voice?" Edgar's lips moved, but the voice that came out didn't sound quite like his own. It was deeper, more formal, clinical. The voice described in precise medical detail what was happening in Edgar's throat. A partial paralysis of the vocal cords caused by psychological stress. The voice then prescribed a treatment. Specific suggestions: increased blood flow to the area, mental imagery, physical therapy. When Edgar woke, he remembered nothing. But over the next few days, following the instructions Hart had written down, Edgar's voice began to return. Within 2 weeks, it was completely restored. Edgar went back to his photography business, tried to move on, tried to forget the whole strange episode, but Hart couldn't let it go. If Edgar could diagnose himself, could he diagnose others? Heart, asked Edgar to try, just once. A friend of his was sick. Doctors couldn't figure out what was wrong. Edgar agreed. Reluctantly, he lay down, entered the trance, and delivered a reading. The friend followed the advice and got better. Word spread. People started coming to Edgar with requests, a name, a location, sometimes a brief description of symptoms. Edgar would lie down, close his eyes, enter his trance, and deliver what he called a reading. He didn't charge money at first, didn't advertise, didn't seek publicity, but the readings kept coming, and people kept getting results. Chapter 3. Medical Knowledge Without Training. Let's be very clear about something. Edgar Cayce had an 8th grade education from a rural Kentucky school. He had no medical training. He never attended college, never studied anatomy, never read medical textbooks. While awake, he couldn't tell you the difference between the liver and the pancreas, but while asleep he became something else entirely. Typical reading would go like this. Someone would write to Edgar, sometimes from across the country. They'd provide a name, an address, and maybe a brief description of symptoms. Often, they provided nothing but a name. Edgar would lie down on his couch. His wife Gertrude, or later his secretary Gladys Davis, would be present to conduct the session. They would give Edgar the suggestion, "You will have before you the body of so-and-so residing at such and such address. You will go over this body carefully, noting its condition, and you will give the cause of any abnormal conditions you may find, and suggest treatments that will bring about a cure." Edgar's breathing would slow. His body would relax completely, and then he would speak. But the voice wasn't quite his. The vocabulary wasn't his. The knowledge definitely wasn't his. He would describe the person's body in extraordinary detail, name specific organs, identify blockages, inflammations, deficiencies, use medical terminology that had no business coming out of the mouth of a small-town photographer. One reading involved a woman with severe intestinal issues. Edgar, in trance, described a specific section of her colon, used the term ascending colon, identified inflammation in the cecum, recommended dietary changes, specific herbs, and osteopathic manipulation. The woman followed the advice. Her condition improved dramatically. Another case involved a child with seizures. Edgar described electrical imbalances in the nervous system, recommended specific spinal adjustments, named vertebrae by number. The treatments worked. Stenographers documented everything, every word, every reading, dates, names, conditions, outcomes, thousands of readings, thousands of records. Some patients reported dramatic improvement. Others saw moderate results. A few saw no change at all. But the consistency was undeniable. Edgar wasn't guessing. He wasn't using vague language. He was specific, technical, precise, and he was doing it while unconscious. Skeptics immediately asked the obvious questions. Was he reading medical texts while pretending to sleep? Investigation showed he didn't own medical books. His library was mostly religious texts and photography manuals. Was he cold reading? Impossible. Many readings were done for people he'd never met, never spoken to, who lived hundreds or thousands of miles away. Was he accessing the minds of actual physicians? Some theorists suggested this, that Edgar was somehow telepathically connecting to living physicians and extracting information. But that raised its own problems. If Edgar was just channeling existing medical knowledge, why did some of his recommendations contradict standard medical practice of the time? Why did he sometimes recommend treatments that wouldn't be validated by science until decades later? In one reading from the 1920s, Edgar recommended using a specific combination of herbs and dietary changes for a patient with what we would now call an autoimmune disorder. The medical establishment of that era didn't even recognise autoimmune conditions as a category, but the treatment worked. In another case, Edgar described the importance of maintaining proper pH balance in the body. This was years before acid-alkaline balance became a standard concept in nutrition. So where was the information coming from? Edgar himself had no idea. He remembered nothing from his trances. Absolutely nothing. He would wake up and ask Gladys what he'd said. She would read it back to him, and he would stare at the words like they were written in a foreign language. He couldn't explain it, couldn't control it, couldn't turn it off. All he could do was lie down, close his eyes, and let whatever force was using him do its work. And that's the part that makes people uncomfortable. Because if Edgar wasn't consciously accessing this information, then something else was. The question is, what? Chapter 4. Past Lives and Forgotten. Civilizations. For the first 20 years, the readings were almost exclusively medical. Health, diet, treatment, physical ailments. Edgar was comfortable with this. He was helping people. Healing was Christian, charitable. He could reconcile it with his faith. Then, in 1923, everything changed. A man named Arthur Lammers came to Edgar. Wealthy, educated, interested in philosophy and metaphysics. He'd heard about the readings and wanted to try something different. He didn't ask about health. He asked about the soul. Lammers wanted to know about existence, purpose, the nature of reality, why we're here. Edgar hesitated. This wasn't medical. This wasn't safe territory, but Lammers was persuasive, and Edgar was curious, so he lay down, entered the trance, and asked the questions Lammers wanted answered. What came out shocked everyone in the room. The sleeping Edgar began talking about reincarnation, not vaguely, specifically. He described Lammers's past lives, not just one, multiple. He talked about existences in ancient civilizations, Egypt, Persia, early America. He described karmic patterns, lessons being repeated, relationships that spanned lifetimes. When Edgar woke up, Lammers was ecstatic. Edgar was horrified. Reincarnation wasn't Christian doctrine. Edgar had been raised Methodist. He taught Sunday school. He believed in heaven and hell, not cyclical rebirth. But the readings had spoken, and they kept speaking. People started asking about past lives, and the sleeping Edgar answered. He described a woman who had been a healer in ancient Egypt, a man who had been a soldier in Rome, a child who had died young in a previous life and carried trauma into this one. The details were specific. Names, dates, locations, roles. And then he started talking about civilizations that shouldn't exist. He mentioned Atlantis, not as myth, not as allegory, as history. According to the sleeping Edgar, Atlantis was real. It existed in the Atlantic Ocean. It was technologically advanced, and it fell in multiple stages over thousands of years. He described 3 distinct periods of destruction. The first around 50,000 years ago, the second around 28,000 years ago, the final cataclysm around 10,600 years ago. He talked about Atlantean technology, crystals used to harness energy from the sun and earth, aircraft that didn't use combustion, genetic manipulation, knowledge of forces modern science still doesn't fully understand. And he said the Atlanteans destroyed themselves, not through natural disaster alone, through misuse of power. They had knowledge, they had technology, but they lacked wisdom. They used their abilities for control, for domination, for experiments that violated natural law. And the Earth responded. Volcanic eruptions, earthquakes, the shifting of the poles. The continent broke apart. Survivors fled to different parts of the world. Some went to Egypt, some to Central and South America, some to the Mediterranean. And they took their knowledge with them. Mainstream scholars rejected this completely. No evidence, no artifacts, no archaeological support. Atlantis was a story Plato wrote, a philosophical allegory, not a real place. But Edgar kept talking, and the readings became more detailed. He described the governance of Atlantis, the spiritual practices, the temples, the priesthoods. He talked about the misuse of genetic knowledge, experiments that created beings that were part human, part animal, violations of natural order that led to moral decay. He said the final destruction was both punishment and mercy, that the continent had to sink to prevent the corrupted knowledge from spreading further, and he said some of that knowledge was preserved, hidden, waiting. Chapter 5. the Hall of Records. This is where Edgar Cayce's story becomes impossible to ignore, because in multiple readings spanning several years, Edgar described something very specific, a hidden chamber beneath the Great Sphinx in Egypt. He called it the Hall of Records. According to the sleeping Edgar, this chamber was created by survivors of Atlantis who reached Egypt after the final cataclysm. They knew their civilization was ending. They knew the knowledge would be lost, so they preserved it. Not in libraries that could burn, not in texts that could decay. In a sealed chamber designed to last until humanity was ready to find it. Edgar described the location, near the right paw of the Sphinx, buried beneath sand and limestone, accessible through tunnels that connected to other structures in the Giza complex. He said the chamber contained records, not just written texts, physical objects, artifacts, evidence of Atlantean technology and history. He said it would be discovered when humanity reached a certain level of spiritual maturity, when we stopped using knowledge as a weapon and started using it for enlightenment. And he gave a timeline. He suggested it might be found near the end of the 20th century, between 1975 and 2000. Archaeologists laughed. Egyptologists dismissed it as fantasy. The Sphinx had been studied for centuries. There was no chamber, no vault, no hidden history. The case was closed until it wasn't. In 1993, a researcher named John Anthony West partnered with geologist Robert Schoch to study the Sphinx. They weren't looking for the Hall of Records. They were investigating something else entirely. Water erosion. Schoch, examining the Sphinx and the walls of its enclosure, noticed something unusual. The erosion patterns didn't match wind and sand erosion. They matched water erosion. Heavy rainfall, sustained exposure over thousands of years. But Egypt has been arid for at least 4,500 years, which meant the Sphinx would have to be much older than mainstream Egyptology claimed, thousands of years older, old enough to have been exposed to the climate of the last ice age. The implications were staggering. If the Sphinx predated dynastic Egypt, then who built it? Schoch published his findings. The academic community erupted. Critics attacked the methodology, defended the traditional timeline, but the erosion patterns were undeniable. Then came the radar. In 1996, researchers used ground-penetrating radar near the Sphinx. They detected anomalies, cavities beneath the surface, rectangular spaces that didn't match known structures, exactly where Cayce said they would be. Excavation requests were submitted and denied. The Egyptian Ministry of Antiquities cited preservation concerns, structural integrity, the risk of damage to the monument, reasonable explanations, except for one problem. The anomalies were clearly man-made, rectangular, deliberate, not natural voids, which meant something was there. So why not investigate? Why not prove, once and for all, that the Hall of Records is a myth? The Egyptian government has maintained tight control over the Giza Plateau for decades. Access is restricted. Permits are difficult to obtain. Independent research is limited. And when it comes to the Sphinx, that control is absolute. Some say it's about politics. Egypt's cultural heritage is a source of national pride. Any suggestion that Egyptian civilization wasn't entirely indigenous is politically sensitive. Others point to religious concerns. The idea of advanced pre-flood civilizations conflicts with certain Islamic narratives about human history. But conspiracy theorists see something else. They see cavities confirmed by modern technology. They see tunnels acknowledged but sealed. They see surveys conducted but never published. And they ask a question that never quite goes away. If Cayce was wrong, why not prove it conclusively? Why leave the possibility open? Chapter 6. Egypt, the Sphinx, and the questions that won't die. Let's look at what we actually know. In the late 1800s, Egyptology was still a young science. The Sphinx was considered ancient even then, but its exact age was debated. Most scholars settled on around 2500 BCE, attributing it to Pharaoh Khafre of the 4th dynasty. This dating was based primarily on proximity. The Sphinx sits near Khafra's pyramid. A temple nearby contains inscriptions referencing Khafra. Therefore the Sphinx must be his. Logical, but not definitive. Because there's a problem. The Sphinx bears no inscriptions, no cartouches, no hieroglyphic evidence directly linking it to any pharaoh. Its age is inferred, not proven. Enter Edgar Cayce in the 1930s and 40s. He's describing in trance a monument that predates dynastic Egypt by thousands of years. He's talking about chambers beneath it, records hidden by a civilization that mainstream history insists never existed. Academia ignores him. Understandably, he has no credentials, no evidence, just claims made while unconscious. Fast forward to the 1990s. Robert Schoch, a credentialed geologist from Boston University, examines the Sphinx. He's not a conspiracy theorist, he's a scientist, and he's looking at rock. What he sees doesn't match the timeline. The weathering patterns on the Sphinx and its enclosure walls show vertical erosion channels, deep fissures, the kind created by sustained rainfall, not the horizontal abrasion you get from wind and sand. Schoch consults climatologists. When was the last time this region experienced heavy sustained rainfall? The answer, the end of the last ice age, around 9,000 to 11,000 years ago. That would make the Sphinx at least 7,000 years older than the traditional date. Schoch publishes his findings in academic journals. The response is immediate and hostile. Egyptologists argue that he's misinterpreting the geology, that other factors could explain the erosion, that he doesn't understand Egyptian history. Schoch responds that geology doesn't care about historical. Consensus. Rock doesn't lie. The debate rages for years, still ongoing today. But something else happened during this period that received less attention. The radar surveys. In 1996, Egyptian authorities allowed a team to use ground-penetrating radar at Giza. Limited access, specific locations. The results showed subsurface anomalies, cavities, chambers. Some matched known structures, tombs, shafts, already documented, but others didn't. Rectangular spaces beneath the Sphinx, tunnel-like formations connecting different parts of the plateau. The team requested permission to investigate further. Permission was denied. Not, we'll think about it. Not, submit a new proposal. Denied outright. In 1998, Zahi Hawass, then director of the Giza Plateau and later Egypt's Minister of Antiquities, made a statement. He acknowledged the anomalies, confirmed they existed, but said there were no plans to explore them. He cited preservation as the reason. The Sphinx is fragile. Any excavation risks damage. Better to leave it alone. Fair enough. Preservation is important. Except the technology exists to explore without digging. Fibre optic cameras, remote imaging, non-invasive techniques used successfully at other sites. Those requests were also denied, and that's where the conspiracy takes root. Because it's not about whether the Hall of Records exists, it's about the refusal to definitively answer the question. The Egyptian government could end the speculation tomorrow, allow a comprehensive survey, use modern technology, document the findings, prove there's nothing there. They haven't. And conspiracy theorists ask, why? One theory suggests political sensitivity. If the Sphinx predates dynastic Egypt, it implies that advanced civilization existed in the region before the pharaohs. That challenges the narrative of Egypt as the cradle of civilization. That's uncomfortable for national identity. Another theory points to religious concerns. Both Islamic and Christian traditions have specific narratives about pre-flood history. Evidence of advanced ancient civilizations conflicts with those narratives. Better to leave it alone. A darker theory suggests they've already looked, that private surveys have been conducted, that they know what's there, and they've chosen not to reveal it. Because some knowledge changes everything, and maybe the world isn't ready. Edgar Cayce said the Hall of Records would be revealed when humanity reached spiritual maturity, when we could handle the knowledge without destroying ourselves. Maybe we're still waiting, or maybe the people who control access have decided we're not there yet. Either way, the chambers remain sealed, the tunnels remain unexplored, and the questions remain unanswered. Chapter 7. Earth Changes and the Warnings. no one wanted to hear. Edgar Cayce didn't just talk about the past, he talked about the future, and some of what he said keeps people awake at night. Throughout the 1930s and 40s, Cayce delivered readings about what he called Earth changes, dramatic geological and climatic events that would reshape the planet. He predicted pole shifts, not magnetic pole reversals, which are documented scientific phenomena, but physical shifts in the Earth's axis. He described massive earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, tsunamis, rising sea levels. He said portions of the east and west coasts of America would eventually be underwater, that land would rise in the Atlantic and Pacific, that Japan would mostly disappear into the sea. He predicted that the Great Lakes would empty into the Gulf of Mexico, that Europe would be transformed in the blink of an eye, that new land would appear in the Caribbean, specific, dramatic, apocalyptic, and he gave timelines. Some suggested these changes would begin in the late 20th century. Others implied they would unfold gradually over decades or centuries. So what happened? Most of Cayce's specific timeline predictions didn't come true. Japan didn't sink. California didn't fall into the ocean. Europe didn't transform overnight. Skeptics point to this as proof that Cayce was wrong, that his predictions failed, that the whole thing was fantasy. But there's a complication, because while the dramatic events didn't happen on the timeline suggested, the underlying patterns Cayce described are undeniably present. Rising sea levels? Happening. Faster than early climate models predicted. Increasing seismic activity? Debatable, but volcanic eruptions and major earthquakes have been well documented in recent decades. Climate instability? We're living through it. Cayce talked about erratic weather, droughts followed by floods, temperature extremes, seasons becoming unpredictable. Sound familiar? He described ecological collapse, species dying, oceans changing, the Earth reacting to human activity. All of this is documented scientific reality now. So was Cayce wrong about the specifics but right about the pattern? Or is the timeline just longer than he thought? There's another possibility that conspiracy theorists find compelling. Cayce framed many of his predictions not as certainties, but as probabilities. He repeatedly said the future wasn't fixed, that human consciousness could alter outcomes. He talked about free will, choice, the power of collective intention. He said if humanity changed course, if we shifted our relationship with the planet and each other, the worst outcomes could be avoided. Which raises an uncomfortable question. If Cayce's predictions didn't come true, is it because he was wrong? Or because we changed enough to avoid them? Or because the changes are simply unfolding more slowly than expected? There's another layer to this. Cayce didn't just predict physical changes, he predicted spiritual ones. He talked about an awakening, a shift in human consciousness that would coincide with the Earth changes. He said humanity would face a choice between self-destruction and evolution, between maintaining the old paradigm and embracing a new understanding of reality. He described a time when the veil between the physical and spiritual would thin, when people would begin remembering things they'd forgotten, accessing abilities they thought were impossible. He said we would have to choose between fear and love, between separation and unity. And he said the outcome wasn't predetermined. Look around today. We're living through unprecedented technological change. Artificial intelligence, quantum computing, genetic engineering. We're also living through unprecedented social fragmentation, political polarization, ecological crisis, global instability. We're at a decision point. Exactly the kind Cayce described. Maybe his timelines were off. Maybe the specifics were wrong, but the pattern is undeniable. We're being forced to choose, and the Earth is watching to see what we decide. Chapter 8. The institution that kept every word his. Something that doesn't make sense if Edgar Cayce was running a scam. In 1931, an organisation was formally established in Virginia Beach to preserve and study his work. It was called the Association for Research and Enlightenment. The ARE, this wasn't a secret society. It wasn't a cult. It was a non-profit research organisation. And it did something remarkable. It kept everything. Every reading Edgar gave was transcribed by professional stenographers. primarily a woman named Gladys Davis, who worked with Edgar for years. Every word was recorded, dated, filed, names were documented, conditions were noted, follow-up results were tracked when possible. Over 14,000 readings, all archived, all preserved. The organisation didn't hide the failures, didn't edit out the readings that were wrong, didn't spin the outcomes to make Edgar look better. They kept it all. When Edgar died in 1945, his family could have destroyed the records, could have buried the readings that didn't pan out, could have curated the legacy to present only the hits. They didn't. Instead, they made the readings available to researchers, published them in books, created a library, opened the archives to anyone willing to study them seriously. This is not how frauds operate. Frauds cover their tracks. They control the narrative. They avoid documentation that can be scrutinised. Edgar Cayce did the opposite. He created a permanent record that could be analysed, tested, and potentially debunked. Why? If you listen to his own words, the answer is simple. He believed he was being used for something important. He didn't understand it, didn't control it, but he felt a responsibility to preserve it. He was deeply religious, believed in God, taught Sunday school even while giving readings about reincarnation that contradicted his own theology. He struggled with the contradiction his entire life, but he kept going, because people were helped. Not everyone, not always, but enough. The ARE still exists today, still operating in Virginia Beach, still maintaining the archives, still funding research into consciousness, health, and ancient history. Anyone can visit, anyone can read the original readings, anyone can draw their own conclusions. That's transparency. And it raises a simple question. If this was a con, why create evidence that could be used against you? Why document everything? Why invite scrutiny? The usual answer from skeptics is that Edgar genuinely believed what he was doing, that he wasn't intentionally fraudulent, that he was deluded or self-deceived. Possible. But that doesn't explain the medical accuracy, the specific anatomical terminology, the treatments that worked. Self-delusion doesn't give you knowledge you don't have, so we're left with uncomfortable alternatives. Either Edgar was accessing information from somewhere, somehow, or thousands of documented cases of the medical improvement were coincidence and placebo effect. Choose your preferred impossibility. Chapter 9. Why Edgar Cayce doesn't fit anywhere. Here's the problem with Edgar Cayce. He challenges everyone. Religious communities are uncomfortable with him because of reincarnation. Traditional Christianity doesn't support the idea of multiple lives. The soul gets one shot, heaven or hell. That's the framework. Cayce, a devout Christian, claimed his readings came from a divine source, but they talked about karma, past lives, souls incarnating repeatedly to learn lessons. He struggled with this himself, taught Sunday school, read his Bible daily, prayed for guidance. But the sleeping Edgar kept talking about reincarnation, so religious institutions sidelined him. Not condemned, not embraced, just quietly set aside as too problematic to integrate. Scientists reject him for different reasons. His claims can't be tested in controlled environments. You can't run a double-blind study on past life readings. You can't peer-review trance states. Medical claims are anecdotal. No control groups. No placebo comparison. Just testimonials and case studies. From a scientific standpoint, that's not evidence. Even the medical readings that worked could be explained by placebo effect, misdiagnosis, natural recovery, or pure chance. So mainstream science dismisses him. Not worth investigating. Too subjective. Too uncontrolled. Historians have their own issues. Atlantis isn't part of the accepted narrative. No artifacts, no ruins, no archaeological consensus. Every few years, someone claims to have found Atlantis, the Azores, Antarctica, the Caribbean, the Mediterranean. None of the claims hold up to scrutiny, so historians treat Cayce as pseudo-history, mythology, entertainment, not serious research. Even alternative history communities have mixed feelings. Some embrace him, others find his claims too specific, too detailed, too vulnerable to disproof. So Cayce doesn't fit anywhere. He challenges traditional religion. He contradicts linear history. He defies materialist science. He's too spiritual for skeptics and too specific for mystics. And ideas that don't fit into established systems aren't usually destroyed. They're sidelined, ignored, marginalised, kept at a distance, which is exactly what happened. Cayce's work is available, published, archived. You can read every word if you want, but it's not taught in schools, not referenced in textbooks, not integrated into any mainstream discourse. It exists in a strange liminal space, too documented to dismiss, too anomalous to accept, and maybe that's intentional, because if you wanted to suppress an idea without drawing attention to it, you wouldn't ban it. You'd simply make sure it never reaches the mainstream. You'd let it exist, but label it fringe, alternative, unserious. You'd ensure that anyone who takes it seriously is immediately categorized as a conspiracy theorist, a believer, someone who can't be trusted with rigorous thought. And over time, the idea becomes self-quarantining. People stop investigating because they don't want to be associated with it, which is exactly what happened to Edgar Cayce. He's known, but not respected, studied, but not seriously, referenced, but never integrated, and the questions he raised remain unanswered, not because they've been disproven, but because investigating them seriously comes with social and professional costs most people aren't willing to pay. Chapter 10: The Modern Resurgence and the Questions That Won't Go Away. Edgar Cayce died on January 3rd, 1945, quietly, at his home in Virginia Beach. His last reading had been for himself. His health had been failing. The trance told him to rest, to stop giving readings. He couldn't. Too many people needed help, too many requests. He pushed through, gave readings until his body gave out, and then he was gone. The readings remained, archived, mostly forgotten by the mainstream, but something strange happened over the following decades. Interest didn't fade. It grew, slowly at first, then faster. The 1960s counterculture discovered Cayce. Young people questioning authority, exploring consciousness, rejecting materialist reductionism. They read the readings, found ideas that resonated. Reincarnation, higher consciousness, ancient wisdom, alternative healing. Cayce became a symbol, not mainstream, not academic, but culturally relevant. Then came the New Age movement of the 70s and 80s. Cayce's ideas fit perfectly. Holistic health, spiritual evolution, past life regression. Books about Cayce sold millions of copies. The ARE grew. Study groups formed worldwide. But it was still fringe, still alternative, still dismissed by serious institutions. Then something shifted in the late 20th and early 21st centuries. Science started catching up. Consciousness research became legitimate. Princeton, Stanford, University of Virginia, credentialed researchers studying near-death, experiences, past life memories in children, remote viewing. Results were published in peer-reviewed journals, not proof of reincarnation, but data that couldn't be easily explained by conventional models. Ancient history started shifting. Göbekli Tepe was excavated in Turkey. A megalithic temple complex dated to 9,600 BCE. Older than Stonehenge by 6,000 years. Older than the pyramids by 7,000. Built by people who, according to mainstream archaeology, shouldn't have been capable of such construction. The Younger Dryas impact hypothesis gained traction. Evidence of a comet strike around 10,800 years ago that caused rapid climate change, global flooding, mass extinction. Exactly the time frame Cayce described for the final destruction of Atlantis. Graham Hancock published Fingerprints of the Gods. Randall Carlson presented geological evidence for cataclysmic flooding. Robert Schoch challenged the dating of the Sphinx. Suddenly, ideas that had been dismissed as fringe were being discussed by credentialed researchers. Not proof, but legitimacy. The questions Cayce raised 70 years earlier were finally being asked by people with PhDs, and the answers weren't coming back as simple dismissals. The Sphinx water erosion theory hasn't been resolved. The debate continues. The subsurface anomalies beneath the Sphinx haven't been explained. The chambers remain unexplored. Ground-penetrating radar has confirmed cavities and tunnels, but access remains restricted. Climate data confirms massive global upheaval around 10,000 years ago. Rapid sea level rise, temperature spikes, ecological collapse. Genetic research shows evidence of population bottlenecks. Sudden reductions in human genetic diversity around the same period. None of this proves Atlantis, but it proves cataclysm. It proves lost history. It proves that conventional timelines might be incomplete. And that's why Cayce is relevant again. Not because his predictions came true in the way he described, but because the world finally started asking the kinds of questions he was asking. Questions about consciousness, about ancient knowledge, about what we've forgotten. Questions that don't fit neatly into academic disciplines. Questions that require crossing boundaries between science, spirituality, and history. The kind of questions institutions hate because they threaten established narratives. But people keep asking them anyway, because the anomalies keep piling up, and the official explanations keep feeling less sufficient. Chapter 11. The Readings That Still Haunt Researchers. Let's talk about some specific readings that refuse to be easily dismissed. Reading number 195-43, given in 1934 for a woman experiencing severe arthritis. The sleeping Edgar described the condition as an accumulation of toxins in the lymphatic system. He recommended a specific diet. Elimination of nightshade, vegetables, increased water intake, spinal manipulations at specific vertebrae. He named the vertebrae by number, thoracic 7 and 8, lumbar 2. He described the mechanical relationship between spinal alignment and lymphatic drainage. This was 1934. The connection between spinal health and immune function wasn't part of medical consensus. The woman followed the recommendations. Her arthritis improved significantly within 3 months. Reading number 294-185. Given in 1941 for a child with severe behavioural issues. Edgar described a neurological condition caused by birth trauma. He recommended cranial adjustments using a specific technique that wouldn't be formally developed until the 1970s. He described pressure points on the skull, gentle manipulation to release tension in the cranial bones. The parents found a practitioner willing to try. The child's behaviour normalised over the following months. Reading number 5748-6, given in 1932 about ancient Egypt. Edgar described a period he called the Second Dynasty, when outsiders came to Egypt with advanced knowledge. He said they came from a land that had been destroyed by water. He described their integration with native Egyptian populations, the construction of temples, the establishment of mystery schools. He said evidence of their arrival would be found in specific tombs, named locations that hadn't been excavated yet. In 1987, a tomb was discovered at Saqqara. Dating showed it was from the transitional period between pre-dynastic and dynastic Egypt. The burial contained artifacts that didn't match the indigenous cultural style, showed evidence of external influence, not proof of Atlantis, but anomalous. Reading number 3579-1, given in 1943 about future technological developments. Edgar described machines that would allow people to see inside the human body without surgery. He used the phrase electrical radiations and magnetic impulses. This was 1943. MRI technology wouldn't be developed until the 1970s. Reading number 826-8, given in 1935 about archaeological discoveries. Edgar said evidence of ancient civilization would be found in 3 locations: Egypt, the Yucatan, and in the Atlantic near Bimini. In 1968, geometric stone structures were discovered underwater near Bimini, arranged in patterns that suggested human construction. Mainstream archaeology attributes them to natural formations, but the debate continues. These are just a few examples from thousands of readings. Some were wrong, some were vague, some can't be verified, but enough were specific and accurate enough to keep researchers digging through the archives, looking for patterns, connections, predictions that might still come true, and occasionally finding things that make them wonder. Chapter 12. The personal cost of being a channel. People often forget that Edgar Cayce was a real person, not a legend, not a myth, a man with a family, bills, doubts, and fears. And being Edgar Cayce nearly destroyed him. The readings took a physical toll. Each trance session depleted him, left him exhausted, sometimes disoriented for hours afterward. As demand increased, so did the frequency of readings. In the early years, he limited himself to 1 or 2 a day. By the 1940s, people were desperate. World War II was raging. Soldiers wanted readings. Families wanted guidance. Edgar pushed himself. Sometimes 4 readings a day, sometimes more. His body couldn't handle it. He developed health problems, fatigue, stress-related illnesses. The readings themselves told him to slow down, to rest. He couldn't, because for every person he helped, 10 more were waiting. The psychological toll was worse. Edgar was a devout Christian. He believed in Jesus, heaven, hell, the resurrection. But the sleeping Edgar talked about reincarnation, past lives, karma. How do you reconcile that? He prayed constantly, asked God for guidance, sought reassurance that what he was doing wasn't evil. Church leaders were skeptical. Some called it demonic. Others were simply confused. Edgar taught Sunday school for years, even while giving readings that contradicted traditional Christian doctrine. He lived in constant tension between faith and experience. The readings said one thing, his church said another. He chose to trust that God was working through him, even if he didn't understand how. But it cost him. He lost friends, faced criticism, was accused of being a satanic channel by some religious communities. His family struggled too. His wife Gertrude supported him, but she worried. Watched her husband exhaust himself, saw the toll it took. Their son Hugh Lynn worked with, Yari helping preserve the readings, but he also had to defend his father against constant accusations of fraud. The Cayce family lived modestly, never became wealthy, never sought fame. Edgar could have commercialized the readings, could have charged more, could have built an empire. He didn't. He lived in a small house, worked as a photographer when he could, gave readings for suggested donations that barely covered expenses, because he believed it wasn't his gift. It was something he was being allowed to use, and using it for profit felt wrong. So he struggled financially, gave readings out of obligation, exhausted himself, and eventually his body gave out. In September 1944, Edgar collapsed. The readings told him he needed complete rest. Months of recovery. He ignored the advice. Too many requests. Too many people suffering. He kept going until he physically couldn't anymore. His final reading was for himself. December 1st, 1944. The sleeping. Edgar said it was time to stop, that he had done enough, that he needed to rest. Edgar woke up, knew it was the last reading, and died 5 weeks later. January 3rd, 1945. His wife Gertrude died 3 months after him. The readings were over, but the questions remained. Epilogue. The knowledge that waits in the dark. Edgar Cayce's story doesn't have a clean ending. There's no dramatic revelation, no final proof, no moment where everything suddenly makes sense. Just a man who spent 43 years lying on a couch with his eyes closed, speaking words he didn't remember, helping people he never met, describing things he shouldn't have known. And then he died, leaving behind 14,000 transcribed readings, thousands of documented cases, an organisation dedicated to preserving his work, and questions. So many questions. The Hall of Records has never been found, or at least never publicly acknowledged. The chambers beneath the Sphinx remain unexplored. The predictions about Earth changes haven't fully materialised, or maybe they're just unfolding slower than expected. Atlantis remains unproven, lost, mythical. But the erosion on the Sphinx still doesn't match the timeline. The subsurface anomalies are still there. The climate cataclysm around 10,000 years ago is still documented, and people keep discovering things that make Edgar Cayce's readings feel less impossible. In 2008, researchers using satellite imaging discovered hundreds of previously unknown structures in the Egyptian desert. Temples, settlements, roads, hidden beneath the sand. In 2017, scientists confirmed that a massive cosmic impact occurred around 10,800 years ago, exactly the period Cayce described for the final destruction of Atlantis. In 2020, genetic research revealed evidence of an unknown human population that contributed DNA to modern humans. A ghost population that existed and then disappeared. None of this proves Cayce was right, but it proves that history is incomplete, that our understanding of ancient civilization is limited, that catastrophic events have reshaped human development in ways we're only beginning to understand, and it raises a possibility that makes a lot of people uncomfortable. What if Edgar Cayce was accessing real information? Not through psychic powers, not through channeling spirits, but through some mechanism of consciousness we don't yet understand. What if memory isn't entirely stored in the brain? What if information exists in fields we can't measure yet? What if some people, under certain conditions, can access that information? Not because they're special, but because they're tuned to a frequency the rest of us have forgotten how to hear. This isn't mysticism. It's a hypothesis. Consciousness researchers at institutions like Princeton and the University of Virginia have documented phenomena that don't fit materialist models. Near-death. Experiences with verifiable details the patient couldn't have known. Children remembering past lives with specific information later confirmed. Remote viewing experiments with statistically significant results. None of it is proof, but it's data. Real data. And it suggests that consciousness might not be as localized as we assume. That information might not be as isolated as we believe. That knowledge might exist in ways we haven't figured out how to measure. Edgar Cayce might have been accessing that. Or he might have been a very talented fraud who got lucky more often than statistics would predict. Choose your preferred explanation. But here's what we know for certain. The readings exist. Documented. Preserved. Available for anyone to study. Some contain information that Cayce, while awake, couldn't have known. Some describe treatments that work. Some make predictions that came true. And some describe a hidden chamber beneath the Sphinx that has never been definitively proven or disproven. Because the people who control access haven't allowed a comprehensive investigation, and maybe they never will. Because some knowledge changes everything, and maybe the world isn't ready. Cayce said the Hall of Records would be revealed when humanity reached spiritual maturity, when we could handle the knowledge without destroying ourselves. Maybe we're still waiting, or maybe the Hall of Records isn't a physical place. Maybe it's a metaphor for knowledge that exists, that waits, that doesn't reveal itself until the people searching for it are ready to handle what they find. Knowledge that doesn't disappear when we stop believing in it. It just waits, quietly, patiently. In the dark beneath monuments we think we understand. In the gaps of history we haven't explored. In the spaces between what we know and what we're afraid to discover. Edgar Cayce spent his life trying to bring that knowledge into the light. He succeeded just enough to prove it might exist, and failed just enough that we can still pretend it doesn't. Which might be exactly the balance we need right now, because the one thing his story teaches us is this. Some truths don't force themselves on you. They wait. Until you're brave enough to ask the questions, strong enough to accept the answers, and mature enough to use the knowledge without destroying yourself. Maybe we're getting there, or maybe we have a long way to go, but the readings remain, the chambers remain sealed, the questions remain unanswered, and somewhere beneath the sand, beneath the stone, beneath the certainty of everything we think we know, something waits. The Pressure Files. What really happened to the OceanGate submersible? Hey everyone! Before we dive into tonight's story, I want to ask you something that would really help the channel grow. If you're enjoying this documentary, please consider using your hype points on this video. It helps us more than you possibly know, and allows us to keep bringing you these deep dive investigations. Also, if you're up for it, drop a comment letting us know what time it is where you are and where in the world you're listening from. We absolutely love seeing where everyone is tuning in from, but only if you want to share. Now let's get into tonight's investigation. A massive thank you to Vortex and Scarlet Widow for submitting this idea. This is exactly the kind of story we live for here at Sleep Theories, where documented truth is stranger than fiction. On June 18th, 2023, 5 people descended toward the wreck of the Titanic in a submersible called Titan. None of them would return alive. The world was told it was a tragic accident, a catastrophic implosion caused by structural failure. But what if the official story is incomplete? What if there's evidence that something else happened down there in the crushing darkness, something that powerful institutions have worked very hard to keep quiet? Tonight we're going to examine the data they never released, the messages that disappeared, and the acoustic anomalies that don't match the narrative you've been told. This is the story of the Pressure Files, and what really happened to the OceanGate submersible. Part 1. The File That Started Everything. June 26th, 2023. 2 days after the Titan submersible was officially declared lost with all hands, a maritime analyst named Elias North received an email that would change everything. Elias wasn't a household name, but in the tight-knit world of deep-sea exploration and maritime safety analysis, he was respected. He'd spent 15 years working with various ocean research institutions, analysing dive data, and consulting on submersible safety protocols. The email came from an anonymous address, a randomly generated string of letters and numbers that would later prove impossible to trace. There was no message in the body of the email, just a single attachment. The file was named exactly this: Titan_logged_pressure_05190-0618.xlsx. Elias almost deleted it. Anonymous files from unknown sources were usually spam or worse, but something about the specificity of that file name made him pause. The dates caught his attention immediately. May 19th through June 18th. That ending date was the day Titan went down. He opened the file. What he found inside was extraordinary. Dozens upon dozens of entries, technical readings that appeared to be genuine OceanGate internal logs. Pressure readings, acoustic measurements, hull stress, calculations, things that should never have left the company's secure servers. Each entry was time-stamped, geo-tagged with coordinates, and included detailed technical annotations. Elias spent the first hour simply verifying what he could. The formatting matched OceanGate's known data structure. The technical terminology was correct. The coordinate readings aligned with known Titan dive locations from previous expeditions. Everything about the file screamed authenticity. But it was one specific entry that made his hands shake as he scrolled through the spreadsheet. June 18th, 0854, Coordinated Universal Time. Exactly the morning of the implosion, just minutes before Titan went silent. The entry read, Extremely Rapid Compression. Dash source, unknown. Dash external origin. External origin. Not a hull failure. Not an internal structural collapse. Something from outside the submersible. Elias read the line again. Then again. Then he started going through every other entry in the file, and what he discovered was even more disturbing. The pressure anomalies didn't start on June 18th. They went back weeks. There were irregular readings on multiple previous dives, entries that suggested Titan had been experiencing unexplained external pressure events long before its final journey. This contradicted everything the public had been told. The narrative was simple, almost reassuring in its clarity. Titan was an experimental submersible that had pushed its materials beyond safe limits. The hull failed. The occupants died instantly. Tragic, but explainable. A cautionary tale about innovation outpacing safety. But if this file was real, that story was incomplete at best, and deliberately misleading at worst. Elias saved 3 copies of the file to different secure locations, then began the most important investigation of his career. He had no idea that within weeks he would become one of the most sought after and simultaneously invisible figures in the deep-sea exploration community. And he definitely didn't know that powerful forces were already aware of what he'd received. Part 2. The Real Timeline. Before we go further into what Elias discovered, we need to establish the facts, the undisputed events that everyone agrees happened. Because the conspiracy here isn't about inventing fiction, it's about the spaces between the official facts, the gaps where uncomfortable questions live. OceanGate Expeditions was founded in 2009 by Stockton Rush and others. The company's mission was to make deep-sea exploration more accessible, to create submersibles that could take tourists and researchers to depths that had previously been accessible only to military or government-funded operations. It was an ambitious, even noble goal. The Titan itself was an unusual submersible. Unlike traditional designs that used heavy titanium spheres, Titan's passenger hull was made from carbon fibre and titanium. This made it lighter, and theoretically capable of faster descents and ascents. But carbon fibre behaves differently under repeated pressure cycling than titanium. It doesn't fail gradually. When it fails catastrophically. Titan began making dives to the Titanic wreck site starting in 2021. The RMS Titanic rests at approximately 3,800 metres below the surface, about 2.5 miles down. At that depth, the pressure is roughly 375 times what we experience at sea level. Every square inch of surface area experiences thousands of pounds of force. The dive that ended in tragedy launched on June 18th, 2023. Aboard were 5 people: Stockton Rush, the CEO of OceanGate and the pilot; Hamish Harding, a British businessman and adventurer; Shahzada Dawood and his son Suleiman Dawood, a Pakistani businessman and his 19-year-old son; and Paul-Henri Nargiolet, a French deep-sea explorer who had visited the Titanic wreck more than 30 times. Titan lost contact with its support ship, the Polar Prince, 1 hour and 45 minutes into its descent. The last communication was a routine status message, then nothing. What followed was a massive search and rescue operation. Ships and aircraft from multiple nations converged on the area. The world watched and hoped. For days there was the possibility, however slim, that Titan was intact somewhere on the ocean floor, its occupants alive but unable to communicate. On June 22nd, debris was found near the Titanic wreck site. The pattern of the debris made it clear what had happened. Catastrophic implosion. The pressure hull had failed, and the implosion would have been instantaneous. The occupants would not have suffered. They would have died faster than their nervous systems could even register pain. Then came the detail that made Elias's anonymous file so significant. On June 28th, the United States Navy confirmed something remarkable. Their underwater acoustic monitoring system had detected what they called anomalous acoustic signatures at the time Titan went silent. In other words, the Navy had heard the implosion happen in real time. They'd known for days that Titan was lost, but they hadn't said anything publicly, supposedly to avoid compromising classified monitoring capabilities. That acoustic signature would become crucial to Elias's investigation. Part 3. The logs don't lie. Elias spent the next week doing something unusual for someone who received an anonymous leak. He tried to disprove it. He looked for any evidence that the file was fabricated, that someone had created an elaborate hoax. He contacted former OceanGate contractors through carefully worded inquiries that didn't reveal what he had. He cross-referenced the technical data with publicly available information about Titan specifications. Everything checked out. More disturbing, some of the technical details in the file matched, things that had never been made public. Specific serial numbers for sensors, internal code designations for monitoring systems, the kind of information that only someone with direct access to OceanGate systems would know. The pressure anomalies painted a disturbing picture. The file showed that Titan had experienced unexplained external pressure events on at least 6 separate occasions over the 3 weeks leading up to the final dive. These weren't the normal, gradual pressure increases you'd expect during descent. These were sudden spikes, moments where the external pressure on the hull increased dramatically for a few seconds, then returned to expected levels. On June 3rd, during a dive that had been publicly reported as successful, the log showed a pressure spike at 2,000 meters depth. The annotation read, "External percussion event dash source unidentified dash no damage observed." On June 9th, another spike, this time at 3,000 meters. Hull stress monitors registered readings that should have caused alarms, but apparently didn't. On June 14th, 4 days before the final dive, the most significant pre-disaster event occurred. At 3,500 meters, Titan experienced what the log described as lateral compression. Not pressure from above, which would be normal, not pressure equally distributed, which the hull was designed for. Pressure from the side, as if something had struck or pressed against the hull. The annotation on that entry was chilling. Microfracture, detected in aft hull segment dash, dive aborted dash returned to surface for inspection. Dash fracture could not be visually confirmed. Dash dive cleared for continuation. They knew something was wrong. They detected damage, but they couldn't see it, so they continued operations. Elias began reaching out to people who might be able to help him understand what he was seeing. He contacted metallurgists, pressure system experts, and acoustic engineers. He framed his questions carefully, presenting the data as hypothetical scenarios. What could cause sudden external pressure spikes at depth? What could create lateral compression on a submersible hull? The answers he got were troubling. Multiple experts told him the same thing. In the open ocean, at those depths, there's nothing that should create those kinds of pressure anomalies. The pressure at depth is immense, but it's also constant and predictable. It doesn't spike. It doesn't come from unexpected angles, unless something else is down there. A large object moving past the submersible? Possibly, if it were large enough and moving fast enough. But what moves at that speed at nearly 4,000 meters depth? A sudden current? Unlikely to create the patterns he was seeing. An underwater landslide or methane bubble release? The geology of the Titanic wreck site didn't support that explanation. That left options that no one wanted to say out loud. An undisclosed military vessel, an unknown geological phenomenon, or something else entirely. Part 4. The messages they didn't release public reporting established that Titan communicated with its surface support ship through text messages. This wasn't unusual for submersibles. Voice communication at those depths is difficult and often unreliable. Text messages sent through acoustic modems are more dependable. What the public was told was that Titan's last message was routine, a status update, everything normal. Then silence. But Elias's file contained something else, references to messages that never appeared in any official timeline. 6 messages that, according to the logs, were sent from Titan on June 18th. Between 0830 and 0852, coordinated universal time. The final message was logged as sent at 0853, just 1 minute before the pressure anomaly that appears to have preceded the implosion. The file didn't contain the full text of these messages. Instead, it had brief descriptions, possibly notes made by whoever was monitoring the communication. Elias spent days trying to track down anyone who might have access to the actual message logs. What he pieced together was fragmentary, but deeply unsettling. 0832. Message references visual distortion outside viewport. Description includes the phrase shimmering distortions and request for confirmation of expected visual phenomena at depth. 0837. Message mentions acoustic anomalies, described as metallic impacts not originating from hull stress or normal operational sounds. 0841. Request for sonar scan of surrounding area. Specific mention of possible object below current position. 0845. Query about whether another submersible is operating in the area. 0850. request for immediate surface contact with Expedition Coordinator Nargiolet's previous dive data from the same location. 0853. Partial message, not fully transmitted. Begins with phrase, is there another, then nothing. At 0854, the extreme pressure anomaly. By 0856, Titan had ceased all communication and, according to Navy acoustic data, had imploded. What's extraordinary about these messages isn't just their content, it's that they were never mentioned in any official investigation summary, any press briefing, or any public statement. If they existed, they were deleted or suppressed. If they didn't exist, then why were they referenced in logs that otherwise proved to be completely accurate? Elias tried to approach this logically. Maybe the messages were routine and just not deemed relevant. Maybe they were communication tests. Maybe there was a mundane explanation. But he kept coming back to that June 18th entry at 0845. Query about whether another submersible is operating in the area. Why would Titan ask that question? What did they see or detect that made them think there was another vessel nearby? Part 5. The sounds. Nobody explained. The search for Titan captured global attention for days. Ships and aircraft searched the surface. Remotely operated vehicles searched the depths, and the whole time, acoustic monitoring equipment listened for any sign of the missing submersible. On June 20th, 2 days after Titan went missing, a Canadian P-3 Poseidon aircraft dropped sonobuoys into the search area. These devices float on the surface and extend hydrophones deep into the water to listen for sounds. Multiple sonobuoys detected what search coordinators described as banging noises at 30-minute intervals. This gave hope. Banging noises meant someone alive, trying to signal their location. The search intensified around the areas where the sounds were detected, but later analysis complicated the story. The banging sounds, it turned out, could have been anything. Underwater sounds travel in strange ways, reflecting and refracting, sometimes appearing to come from locations far from their actual source. Marine life, shifting metal on the ocean floor, even the search ships themselves could have created the sounds. The official position eventually became that the sounds were probably not related to Titan at all. Just acoustic artifacts of a noisy ocean environment. Elias's investigation revealed a different story. Through contacts he'd developed in the acoustic analysis community, Elias obtained copies of the actual sonobuoy recordings. Not the official summaries, not the press briefing descriptions, but the raw audio files and their technical analysis. What he found was extraordinary. The sounds detected on June 20th were not random. They occurred in patterns, every 30 minutes as reported. But the pattern was too regular, too mechanical. Human banging, even desperate human banging, would have variations in timing, in intensity, in rhythm. These sounds had none of that. They were metronomic, precise. More significant spectral analysis of the sounds showed frequency components that didn't match impacts on titanium or carbon fibre. The sounds had characteristics more consistent with sonar pings, specifically active sonar reflecting off a hard surface. In other words, something was down there using sonar, and whatever it wasn't Titan. Elias consulted with a retired naval acoustic technician named Marcus Webb, a man who'd spent 25 years listening to submarine sounds for the United States Navy. Webb lived in a small coastal town in Maine, and he agreed to meet Elias only after extensive vetting and assurances of anonymity. Webb analysed the recordings Elias had obtained. His conclusion was unequivocal. "This is active sonar," Webb told him. "Low frequency, high power, the kind of signature you get from a large object probably moving. And here's the thing that should concern you. I've heard a lot of sonar in my career. Russian submarines, Chinese submarines, our own boats, research vessels, you name it. This doesn't match anything in my reference library. The pulse structure is wrong. The frequency modulation is wrong. It's like someone built a sonar system that works on principles just slightly different from everyone else's." Elias asked the obvious question. Could it be classified military technology? Something we don't know about? Webb shrugged. Could be. But we're talking about the Titanic wreck site. That location isn't strategically important. There's no reason for any military to be operating experimental sonar systems there, unless they were looking for something specific. Like what? That's the question you should be asking. What's down there worth looking for? Part 6. The Navy's incomplete story. The United States Navy's acoustic monitoring system is called IUSS, the Integrated Underwater Surveillance System. It's a network of hydrophones scattered across the ocean floor, originally designed during the Cold War to track Soviet submarines. The system is so sensitive it can detect ships and submarines thousands of miles away. When the Navy announced on June 28th that they'd detected acoustic signatures consistent with Titan's implosion, it seemed like closure. They'd heard it happen. They could pinpoint when it occurred. The mystery of timing was solved. But Elias noticed something in the Navy's statement that bothered him. They said they detected signatures, plural, not signature, and they described them as anomalous. Not standard, not typical, not matching known implosion patterns. Anomalous. Through careful networking and more than one questionable information exchange, Elias obtained a document that would crack open the entire investigation. It was marked NAVCA, the Naval Sea Systems Command, with a classification header that had been partially redacted. The document was titled Atlantic Command Acoustic Analysis Event 0623 Echo. June 23rd was when debris from Titan was officially found. Echo was presumably just a designation code. But the contents of the document were extraordinary. The Navy had indeed detected Titan's implosion, but their analysis showed something nobody had made public. There were two distinct acoustic events, separated by 0.8 seconds. Less than a second, but clearly distinguishable in the high-fidelity recordings the IUSS system captured. The first event matched the expected signature of a pressure hull failure at depth. A sharp, powerful acoustic pulse. The sound of air-filled space suddenly collapsing under immense pressure. That was Titan imploding. But the second event, 0.8 seconds later, was different. The acoustic signature showed a different frequency profile, a different duration, and a different apparent point of origin. It was close to Titan, very close, but not the same location. The report's conclusion, partially redacted, suggested two possibilities. Either Titan imploded in stages, with different sections of the hull failing in rapid succession, or something else collapsed or impacted the ocean floor at nearly the same moment. The report recommended further analysis. That's where the document ended. Elias found no evidence that further analysis was ever conducted, or if it was buried deeper than he could dig. But the implications were staggering. If something else created an acoustic signature at the moment Titan imploded, what was it? And was it cause or coincidence? Part 7. The warning they ignored. As Elias dug deeper into OceanGate's history, he discovered that the problems with Titan went back much further than anyone publicly acknowledged. In 2019, 4 years before the disaster, Titan underwent a test dive that was aborted under concerning circumstances. The publicly available information about this dive was minimal. A test was conducted, some data was gathered, the dive ended early, end of story. But Elias found references to an internal report from that dive buried in technical forums where former OceanGate contractors sometimes posted anonymously. The 2019 test dive reached a depth of approximately 3,500 metres, just slightly shallower than the Titanic wreck site. During the dive, Titan's monitoring systems detected what the report called unexplained acoustic spikes. The hull stress sensors showed pressure distortions that didn't match modelled expectations, and most concerning, there was a notation about unknown external contact. Something touched the submersible, or got very close to it, at 3,500 metres depth in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. The dive was aborted immediately. Titan returned to the surface. Engineers examined every inch of the hull and found nothing wrong. No damage, no stress marks, no evidence of contact with anything. So they did what organisations often do when faced with an anomaly that can't be explained or repeated. They noted it in their records, decided it must have been a sensor glitch or a data interpretation error and moved on. But now Elias thought, what if it wasn't a glitch? What if in 2019 Titan encountered the same thing it would encounter fatally in 2023? And what if the difference was that in 2019 they turned back? He tried to find the engineers who worked on that 2019 analysis. 2 of them no longer worked in the maritime industry. One had moved to aerospace, another was working in renewable energy. When Elias contacted them through carefully worded LinkedIn messages, both declined to discuss their time at OceanGate, citing non-disclosure agreements. But one engineer, who requested absolute anonymity, sent Elias a brief message. We found microscopic stress patterns in the hull after that dive that shouldn't have been there. Not from internal pressure, from external. Like something pressed against the hull with immense force, but only for a fraction of a second. Not long enough to cause failure, but long enough to leave a signature in the material structure. We were told to note it and move on. I think about that a lot now. Part 8. The Corridor. Everyone monitors. Marcus Webb, the retired Navy acoustic technician, told Elias something during their meeting that opened an entirely new line of investigation. You need to understand something about that area of the Atlantic, Webb said. The region around the Titanic wreck is one of the most acoustically monitored sections of ocean in the world. Elias was surprised. Why? It's not near any major shipping lanes. It's not strategically important. Webb smiled grimly. That's what makes it perfect. It's quiet. Background noise is minimal. Sound propagates clearly through the water column. During the Cold War, both we and the Soviets used that area as a reference point for calibrating acoustic systems. We knew the baseline acoustic signature of that region better than almost anywhere else in the ocean. So when something moves through there, when something creates sound, we notice. So the Navy would have known if there were any submarines in the area when Titan went down. Absolutely. They would have known about any vessel, any significant biological activity, any geological events. That corridor is transparent to acoustic monitoring. Nothing moves down there without someone hearing it. Then why, Elias asked, did the public receive so little information about what was detected? Webb's expression darkened. That's the question, isn't it? Either they detected nothing unusual, which seems unlikely given the anomalous signatures they admitted to, or they detected something they don't want to discuss. Elias spent the next several days researching the acoustic history of the Titanic wreck region. What he found was fascinating and disturbing. Since the 1980s, when the wreck was first discovered, there had been sporadic reports of unusual acoustic phenomena in the area. Nothing that made headlines, just footnotes in oceanographic research papers, metallic echoes that didn't correspond to the wreck itself, high-strength reflective signatures suggesting large metal objects in areas where no objects were charted, and occasional reports of objects moving faster than known submersibles or marine life could move at those depths. Every time these anomalies were detected, they were attributed to equipment malfunction, acoustic reflections from the wreck creating false images, or misidentification of known phenomena, standard scientific explanations for non-standard observations. But taken together, over decades, they painted a picture of a region where strange things happened with just enough regularity to be notable, but not enough to trigger serious investigation. Until now. Until Titan. Part 9. Nargeolet's Secret Map. Paul-Henri Nargeolet was 77 years old when he died aboard Titan. He'd spent decades exploring the Titanic wreck, earning the nickname Mr. Titanic. He knew that wreck site better than perhaps anyone alive. He'd documented it, studied it, and helped recover thousands of artifacts from the debris field. After the disaster, Nargeolet's contributions to Titanic research were widely celebrated. But Elias became interested in something else, what Nargeolet had been researching in the years before his death. Through contacts in the maritime archaeology community, Elias learned that Nargeolet had been working on a comprehensive sonar mapping project of the area surrounding the Titanic wreck. Not just the wreck itself, but the ocean floor for several kilometres in every direction. This wasn't public work, it was personal research, conducted during his many dives to the site. Nargeolet had apparently become fascinated by geological formations in the region, particularly to the east of the wreck. Elias managed to speak with a French oceanographer who had collaborated with Nargeolet on some projects. The oceanographer, who spoke on condition of anonymity, told Elias something remarkable. Paul found something unusual about 2 kilometres east of the Titanic, the oceanographer said. He showed me sonar images from one of his dives in 2021. There was a structure on the ocean floor that didn't match the surrounding geology. Very straight edges, almost geometric. Paul was fascinated by it. He called it Site Z. Just a designation he made up. He wanted to do a proper survey of it, but there was never time during the official Titanic dives. What did he think it was? Elias asked. He didn't speculate much. Paul was very careful about that. But he said the formation had anomalous geometry. That was his phrase. He thought it might be an unusual geological feature, possibly a rock formation shaped by ancient currents. But he also said the angles were too precise for natural formation. He wanted to investigate further. Elias felt a chill. Do you know if the Titan dive on June 18th was planning to visit Site Z? The oceanographer paused. I don't know for certain, but Paul mentioned to me in May that he was hoping to finally get a close look at the structure. He said this might be his last season diving at those depths, and he wanted to see it before he stopped. Elias tried to obtain Nargeolet's sonar maps. He contacted archives, research institutions, and personal associates. What he discovered was frustrating. Nargeolet's personal research materials had been collected by his family and were not available for review. Requests through official channels were politely declined. But Elias did find something, a presentation Nargeolet had given at a small maritime conference in 2022. The presentation was about advanced sonar techniques for wreck site mapping. Most of it was technical, but there was one slide near the end that caught Elias's attention. It showed a sonar image, high resolution, of the ocean floor. In the centre of the image was a formation that looked nothing like the surrounding sediment and rock. It was angular, with straight edges and what appeared to be right-angle corners. The slide had minimal text, just a location designation. 41 degrees, 43 minutes north, 49 degrees, 56 minutes west. Elias checked those coordinates, approximately 1,600 metres east of the Titanic wreck. Site Z. Part 10. The Deviation. Nobody mentioned. Titan's descent on June 18th should have been routine. Straight down to the Titanic wreck site, perhaps a slight adjustment for currents, but essentially a vertical descent to a precise location. Using publicly available data about the last known position of Titan's support ship and the known location of the Titanic wreck, Elias began reconstructing the submersible's dive path. He factored in typical current patterns for that region and time of year, the known drift rate of objects descending at the speed Titan would have been travelling, and the established protocols OceanGate used for approaching the wreck site. What he found was subtle but significant. Based on the timing of Titan's last communication and the location where debris was eventually found, the submersible appeared to have deviated from the standard approach path. Not dramatically, but noticeably. The deviation was to the east, towards Site Z. Elias couldn't prove that Titan intentionally headed toward the anomalous formation Nargeolet had been studying. The deviation could have been caused by currents, by a navigation adjustment, by any number of mundane factors. But the direction and magnitude of the deviation were consistent with a course change designed to bring Titan within visual range of coordinates, located 1,600 metres east of the Titanic. More significant, this deviation was not mentioned in any official briefing or investigation summary that Elias could find. The public narrative was that Titan was descending directly to the Titanic when it imploded, but the debris field location suggested otherwise. Why wasn't this mentioned? It could be simple oversight. In the chaos of the investigation and the tragedy of the loss, a minor course deviation might not have seemed important. But to Elias, it suggested something else. If Titan was approaching Site Z, and if that's where something went wrong, then acknowledging the deviation would raise questions about what they were doing there and what they might have found. Part 11. The structure beneath the wreck. Elias needed better data about what was actually on the ocean floor at Site Z. Sonar images from Nargile's presentation were provocative, but not conclusive. He needed to know if other researchers had detected the same anomaly. This led him to the archives of the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution, one of the premier deep ocean research organisations in the world. Woods Hole had been involved in finding the Titanic wreck in 1985 and had conducted numerous surveys of the area in subsequent years. Elias submitted a Freedom of Information Act request for historical sonar data from the Titanic wreck region. Months passed with no response. He followed up repeatedly. Finally, he received a package containing digital files of sonar surveys conducted in the late 1990s. What he found in those surveys was extraordinary. A 1998 comprehensive mapping project had documented a large, unusual formation approximately 2 kilometres east-northeast of the Titanic wreck. The formation was described in technical notes as an unidentified seafloor feature, designated Feature 17B. The sonar images showed a structure with distinctly geometric characteristics. It appeared triangular in plan view, with edges that were remarkably straight given the chaotic nature of natural ocean floor formations. The formation was large, roughly 100 metres along its longest axis, and appeared to rise several metres above the surrounding sediment. Most intriguingly, the feature showed uniform acoustic reflectivity, suggesting it was composed of consistent material throughout, unlike the mixed sediment, rock, and debris typical of the ocean floor in that region. The survey report noted that Feature 17B represented an interesting geological phenomenon and recommended further investigation. As far as Elias could determine, no further investigation was ever conducted, or if it was, the results were not publicly available. Elias consulted with a geological oceanographer about the formation. He sent the sonar images without context, simply asking for an interpretation. The oceanographer's response was cautious, but intrigued. "This is unusual. The geometry is very regular, more regular than I'd expect from natural processes. It could be a rock formation that's been shaped by currents over millennia, but those edges are remarkably straight. It could be a type of sediment deposit, with unusual consolidation properties, or it could be something else entirely. I'd need much higher resolution imaging and possibly core samples to say definitively. Where is this located?" When Elias told him, the oceanographer went silent for a moment, then said, "That's near the Titanic. Has anyone investigated this recently?" "Not that I can find." "That's surprising. You'd think with all the traffic to that wreck site, someone would have taken a closer look at anything unusual in the area. Unless," Elias thought, "someone had taken a closer look and didn't like what they found." Part 12, The Last Image. Elias's investigation had assembled a circumstantial case that something unusual existed at Site Z, that Titan may have approached it, and that the submersible experienced external pressure events consistent with encountering something unexpected. But he had no direct evidence of what the Titan crew actually saw. Then he received a second anonymous message. This one came through an encrypted communication service, far more sophisticated than the original email. The message was brief. "Check the recovered control systems. File path recovered fragments / viewport camera / cache June 18. Titan's debris had been recovered and was under the custody of the National Transportation Safety Board. Some of that debris included electronic components from the submersible's control systems. Officially, no usable data had been recovered. The violence of the implosion and the subsequent time in saltwater had destroyed storage media and corrupted any data that might have survived. But Elias's anonymous source was suggesting otherwise. He spent weeks trying to figure out how to access or even verify the existence of recovered data files. He contacted people involved in the debris recovery, people involved in the investigation, and people who worked in data forensics. Nobody would acknowledge that recoverable data existed. Then, 3 months after the disaster, a small article appeared in a technical journal about advances in recovering data from damaged storage media, specifically mentioning work being done on the Titan investigation. The article was quickly retracted, with a note that it contained premature information, but Elias had saved a copy. The article mentioned that forensic specialists had successfully extracted partial files from a damaged solid-state drive recovered from Titan's control tablet. Most of the data was corrupted, but some image files had been partially reconstructed. Elias pulled every string he had, called in every favour, and eventually, through a chain of contacts that he would never fully reveal, obtained a file. A single image file, low resolution, partially corrupted, with large sections of missing data. But what remained was extraordinary. The image showed the view from Titan's viewport. The timestamp embedded in the file metadata read June 18th, 2023, 0853 Coordinated Universal Time. 2 minutes before the pressure anomaly, 1 minute before Titan's last partial message. The image was dark, as would be expected at that depth, with only Titan's external lights for illumination. But in the illuminated area there was something that didn't look like ocean floor, didn't look like the Titanic wreck, didn't look like anything Elias had ever seen in deep ocean photography. There was a surface, smooth, reflective, catching the light from Titan's floods. The reflectivity suggested metal, though it was impossible to be certain. And there was an edge, a sharp right angle where this surface met another surface perpendicular to it. The image was too corrupted to show more. Large sections of pixels were simply black, missing data. But in the remaining fragments, Elias could make out what appeared to be a corridor or opening, shadows suggesting depth beyond the visible surface, straight lines that spoke of artificial construction, not natural formation. There was only one image. It could have been an artifact of the corruption, pixels randomly aligning to create the illusion of structure. It could have been a reflection or an optical effect Elias wasn't understanding correctly. But it could also have been exactly what it appeared to be, a photograph of something artificial at the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean. Part 13. The Contact. Elias knew he was onto something significant. He'd been careful, using encryption, compartmentalizing his sources, not publishing anything publicly, but someone was paying attention. His phone rang one evening in late September, 3 months after the disaster. The number was blocked. He almost didn't answer, but something made him pick up. Mr. North? A voice, male, professional, unaccented. Who is this? That's not important. What's important is that you stop investigating the structure. Elias felt his pulse quicken. What structure? You know what structure. The formation near the Titanic wreck. The deviation in Titan's descent path. The thing you've been building a case around. Stop. Why? Because it has nothing to do with the vessel failure. Titan failed because of structural inadequacies in its pressure hull. That's been established. Anything else you're pursuing is a distraction. Who are you? Elias asked again. Someone who's trying to help you avoid making a significant mistake. You're a respected analyst. You have a good reputation. Publishing conspiracy theories about secret structures on the ocean floor will destroy that reputation, and it won't accomplish anything. Are you saying there's no structure? A pause. I'm saying that what is or isn't on the ocean floor at that location is irrelevant to the Titan investigation. Then it shouldn't matter if I keep looking. Mr. North, please understand this carefully. There are things in the ocean that are best left undisturbed. The Titan tragedy was about engineering failure and poor decision-making. Making it about anything else serves no one. Walk away from this. And if I don't, the voice remained calm, then you'll find that your sources dry up, your reputation suffers, and your investigation leads nowhere. We're not threatening you, we're advising you, for your own benefit. The call ended. Elias sat in his apartment staring at his phone. The call had confirmed everything. There was something at Site Z. Titan had approached it, and someone with significant resources wanted the whole thing buried alongside the submersible. He immediately began backing up all his files to multiple secure locations. He documented the phone call. He prepared a summary of everything he'd found just in case. 3 days later, he woke up to find his computer's hard drive corrupted. All his local files were gone. His cloud storage accounts had been accessed and wiped. The backup drives he kept in a locked drawer had been remotely formatted. Everything was gone. Everything except the copies he'd hidden in places that weren't connected to any network, the files he'd stored on old USB drives and kept in a safe deposit box, the printed documents he'd mailed to himself and left unopened. Whoever had warned him had followed through. They demonstrated their capability, but they hadn't been quite thorough enough. Part 14. The Final Clue. Elias was scared, but also energized. The deletion of his files proved he was onto something real. You don't suppress information unless that information matters. He spent weeks being paranoid, checking for surveillance, varying his routines, communicating only through encrypted channels. He started rebuilding his research from the hidden backups, but he did it carefully, offline, with no digital footprint. Then, in mid-October, he received one more anonymous communication. This time it was a physical letter, delivered to a P.O. box he maintained under a different name. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a printed NOAA, National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration header. The message was brief. The ocean floor holds things older than the wreck. They didn't want tourists finding out. Attached to the paper was a photograph, high resolution, professional quality, clearly taken by a remotely operated vehicle or submersible equipped with proper lighting. The image showed a section of ocean floor, sediment and rock, and embedded in that rock was a panel. Metal, clearly artificial, roughly 2 meters square. The panel showed signs of corrosion but was still intact. And on the panel's surface, just barely visible under the marine growth, was an edge, a right angle identical to what Elias had seen in the corrupted image from Titan. The photograph had no location data, no timestamp, no context, just the image and that single sentence message. Elias studied the photograph for hours. The metal was definitely artificial. The right angle was too precise to be natural, and the way it was embedded in the rock suggested it had been there for a very long time, not decades, possibly centuries. The surrounding geology showed no signs of recent disturbance. Whatever this was, it had been on the ocean floor near the Titanic wreck for a long time, long enough for rock to partially cover it, long enough for marine growth to obscure its features, but not long enough to be eroded away or consumed by corrosion. Elias considered what he knew. There was an anomalous formation at Site Z. That formation had geometric features inconsistent with natural geology. Nargilé had known about it and wanted to investigate it. Titan had deviated toward it during its final dive. The submersible had experienced external pressure anomalies. The crew had sent messages suggesting they saw something unexpected, and then Titan had imploded, possibly coincidentally, possibly not. And now someone had sent him proof that there was indeed something artificial at that location, something old, something someone very much wanted to keep secret. Part 15. The upload. Elias knew he had to release what he'd found. Keeping it to himself served no purpose, and if something happened to him, the information would be lost. But releasing it through traditional channels would get it suppressed immediately. Academic journals would reject it. Maritime organizations would discredit it. The story would be killed before it ever reached the public. So he did what whistleblowers in the digital age do. He prepared a comprehensive report, including all his evidence, all his sources, all his analysis. He encrypted it and uploaded it to multiple secure platforms. He sent links to journalists, researchers, and activists he trusted. He posted it on forums dedicated to deep-sea mysteries and maritime anomalies. The last line of his report read, "The Titan didn't fail because of bad engineering alone. It failed because it got too close to something it wasn't supposed to find. Something that's been hidden at the bottom of the Atlantic for longer than anyone wants to admit. Something that raises questions our institutions aren't prepared to answer." The response was immediate and overwhelming. Within hours, the report was being shared across the internet. News outlets picked up the story. Other researchers came forward with their own anomalous findings from the Titanic wreck region. The conspiracy gained momentum, and then, 24 hours after Elias posted his report, every link went dead. Every copy of the file showed as corrupted or deleted. The forums where he'd posted were suddenly offline for maintenance. Journalists who'd contacted him stopped responding. The story disappeared almost as quickly as it had appeared, scrubbed from the internet by forces with resources Elias couldn't match. He tried to repost. He created new accounts, used different platforms, sent out new copies of the file. But each time, within hours, everything was deleted. Someone was monitoring the entire internet for any mention of his research and removing it faster than he could spread it. 1 week after his initial upload, Elias received a final message. It came through an encrypted channel he'd thought was secure. Just 3 words: "Stop now, please." Elias made one last attempt. He contacted a documentary filmmaker he knew, someone with a reputation for investigating controversial topics. They agreed to meet in person. No electronic communication, no paper trail. The meeting never happened. Elias didn't show up. Calls to his phone went to voicemail. His apartment was found empty, with no signs of struggle, no indication of where he'd gone. Elias North hasn't been heard from since November 2023. His family filed a missing person report. Police investigated and found no evidence of foul play. His bank accounts haven't been accessed. His phone hasn't been used. He simply vanished. Some say he went into hiding. Some say he was silenced. Some say he never existed at all. That the whole investigation was an elaborate internet hoax. But copies of his report still circulate in the darkest corners of the internet, on encrypted networks, in private forums where people trade information too dangerous to share openly. And people who've read it, people who understand what it implies, look at maps of the Atlantic Ocean a little differently now. Because somewhere 2.5 miles beneath the surface near the wreck of the Titanic, there is something that shouldn't be there. Something old. Something hidden. Something that 5 people got too close to on June 18th, 2023. And the official story, the one about engineering failure and poor decision-making, is true as far as it goes. It just doesn't go far enough. Epilogue. Questions without answers. The OceanGate Titan disaster killed 5 people and ended a company. Investigations determined that the submersible's carbon fibre hull was inadequate for repeated deep dives, that safety protocols were insufficient, that warnings were ignored. All of that is true and documented. But the questions Elias North raised remain unanswered. Why were pressure anomalies detected weeks before the final dive? Why were text messages referencing visual and acoustic anomalies never released? Why did acoustic monitoring detect 2 distinct events during the implosion? What is the geometric formation at Site Z? Why did Titan appear to deviate toward that location? What did the partially recovered image actually show? These questions make people uncomfortable, because they suggest the disaster wasn't just about corporate recklessness and engineering failure. They suggest there was something else involved, something that doesn't fit the narrative we've been told, and maybe that's the point. Maybe some truths are too complicated, too disruptive, too unsettling to acknowledge. Maybe it's easier to accept a story about human error than to confront the possibility that there are things in our ocean we don't understand, things we've been carefully avoiding for reasons we're not privy to. The ocean covers 70% of our planet. We've explored perhaps 5% of it in any meaningful detail. We know more about the surface of Mars than we do about the deepest parts of our own ocean. And in those unexplored depths, in the crushing pressure and absolute darkness, there might be things that have been there longer than human civilization. Things that weren't meant to be found. Things that powerful institutions have known about and decided to keep secret. The Titan is gone. The 5 people aboard are gone. Elias North is gone. But the questions remain, floating in the dark water, waiting for the next person brave or foolish enough to ask them. And somewhere, 2.5 miles down, Site Z is still there, still geometric, still anomalous, still waiting. That's the story of the pressure. Files, the investigation that disappeared, and the questions nobody wants answered. Make of it what you will. Draw your own conclusions, but the next time you hear about deep-sea exploration, about submersibles diving to historic wrecks, about the mysteries of the ocean floor, remember that there are some places where, maybe, just maybe, we're not supposed to go. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this documentary, please use your hype points on the video. It genuinely helps us more than you can imagine, and let us know in the comments what time it is where you are and where you're listening from. We love connecting with all of you around the world. Until next time, this is Sleep Theories, where the truth is always deeper than it seems. Before we begin tonight's story, if you're enjoying the content here on Sleep Theories, please consider using your hype points on this video. It truly helps the channel grow more than you could possibly know, and it allows us to keep bringing you these deep dives into the unexplained. Also, if you'd like, drop a comment letting us know what time it is where you are and where in the world you're listening from. We absolutely love seeing where everyone is tuning in from, but only if you want to share. Now let's get into tonight's investigation. What if the child who came home wasn't entirely the same child who disappeared? There's a photograph that haunts the internet. You've probably seen it. A small boy, dirty and exhausted, wrapped in a blanket, staring into a camera with eyes that seemed far too old for his face. The rescue photo from June 2022, taken moments after 3-year-old Riker Webb was found alive in the Montana wilderness after vanishing for 2 terrifying nights. The world celebrated a miracle. Parents everywhere felt relief wash over them. Search and rescue teams were praised as heroes. The story had a happy ending. But if you look closer at that photograph, if you read between the lines of the official reports, if you listen to the whispers from Lincoln County, Montana, you'll find something else entirely. Something that suggests the miracle wasn't as simple as a lucky find. Something that implies those 2 days in the woods changed more than just a frightened child's perspective. This is the story of what really happened to Riker Webb, or at least what might have happened. Because the truth, as you'll soon discover, has been carefully managed, quietly buried, and deliberately obscured. My name is Elena Ferguson, and I'm a journalist from Spokane, Washington. I spent a year investigating this case, and what I found will make you question everything you thought you knew about missing children, wilderness survival, and the things that live in places humans rarely venture. Intro: the photo that never made sense. June 5, 2022, Montana. When Riker Webb walked out of those woods, when search teams found him inside an abandoned shed nearly 2 miles from his home, the relief was universal. News outlets ran the story with headlines like "Miracle in Montana" and "Toddler beats the odds." His parents wept with joy. The community of Troy, a tiny outpost in Lincoln County with barely 1,000 residents, exhaled collectively. But I remember seeing that photograph for the first time and feeling something other than relief. Call it journalistic instinct or maybe just human intuition. That something was wrong with the picture. Not technically wrong. The image was clear enough. The rescue workers looked appropriately concerned. The blanket wrapped around the boy was standard issue emergency gear. It was his face that bothered me. His hair looked different. Matted, yes, from 2 nights in the rain, and cold. But there was something about the way it framed his features that seemed older somehow, as if he had aged more than 48 hours. His expression didn't match what you would expect from a 3-year-old who just endured a terrifying ordeal alone in bear country. There was no crying, no reaching for parents, no visible fear or relief. Just this calm, almost watchful stare, and his eyes. God, his eyes looked wrong, not injured or diseased, but wrong in a way I couldn't articulate then and still struggle to explain now. They looked like they'd seen something no child should see, something no adult should see for that matter. I wasn't the only one who noticed. Online forums began picking apart the photograph within hours. Reddit threads spawned conspiracy theories. Facebook groups dedicated to missing persons cases flagged the image as unusual. Most of it was the typical internet noise, people seeing patterns where none existed, making mountains from molehills. But some of the observations were harder to dismiss. Someone pointed out that Riker's skin tone seemed different in the rescue photo compared to family pictures taken weeks earlier. Another noted that the way he held his hands seemed too controlled for a traumatized toddler. A retired pediatric nurse commented that his facial expressions suggested a developmental age inconsistent with 3 years old. The mainstream media ignored these observations as they should have. Conspiracy theories about missing children are dangerous territory, and most of the speculation was baseless. Most of it, but not all of it. Because as I dug deeper, as I travelled to Troy and started interviewing people who were actually there, who actually participated in the search, who actually saw Riker in those first hours after he was found, I realised the official story had holes. Big holes. The kind of holes that exist because the truth has been carefully excavated and replaced with something more palatable. This is that truth, or as close as I could get to it. Act 1. The real timeline. Let me start with what we know for certain. The documented facts that nobody disputes. June 3, 2022. Late afternoon, around 4 o'clock, Riker Webb disappeared from his family's yard on Deerwood Lane in Troy, Montana. He'd been playing outside while his parents worked on household projects. The yard backed up to dense wilderness, the kind of thick forest that characterises northwestern Montana, all Douglas fir and western larch, with underbrush so dense you can't see 10 feet in any direction. One moment he was there, the next he wasn't. His parents called the Lincoln County Sheriff's Office immediately. By evening, a full-scale search operation was underway. Ground teams, ATVs, tracking dogs, air support with helicopters, everything you'd mobilise for a missing child in mountain country. The conditions were brutal. Temperatures that night dropped into the low 40s. Heavy rain moved through the area. This was wilderness where mountain lions prowled and black bears were common. The terrain was unforgiving, full of cliffs and ravines and abandoned mining cabins from Montana's resource extraction past. The search continued through June 4th and into June 5th. 72 hours of coordinated effort involving dozens of volunteers, professional search and rescue teams, and law enforcement from multiple agencies. Then, on the morning of June 5, almost exactly 48 hours after he vanished, Riker was found inside a shed on Pine Ridge Road, approximately 2 miles from his home. According to the official report, he was dirty, hungry, quiet, and alert. He showed signs of exposure but no serious injuries. He was taken to a hospital for evaluation, checked out as remarkably healthy given the circumstances, and returned to his grateful parents. Case closed. Miracle achieved. Happy ending secured. Except for the details that didn't make the news, the observations that were logged and then buried, the witness statements that were taken and then classified, the evidence that suggested Riker's survival wasn't miraculous. It was impossible. Let me walk you through what I found. Act 2. The first lies. The shed owner was a man named Reginald Dixon, a retired logger in his 70s, who lived about a quarter mile from the structure where Riker was discovered. I interviewed him at his home, a modest cabin that smelled like wood smoke and old coffee. Reginald was cooperative but clearly uncomfortable. He told me the shed had been locked the last time he checked it, over a week before Riker disappeared. He hadn't stored food there, no blankets, no supplies that might help a child survive. Just tools, he said, staring at his hands. Old equipment I don't use much anymore. The door had a padlock on it. I'm certain of that. But when the search team found Riker, I pressed. The door was open. Wide open, he confirmed. Lock was gone. Never found it. Could Riker have opened it himself? Reginald looked at me like I'd suggested the child could fly. He's 3 years old, miss. That lock required a key. Even if it didn't, even if it was somehow left unlocked, the door swelled from rain. I had to put my shoulder into it last time I opened it. A grown man's shoulder. So someone else opened it. He didn't answer directly. Instead, he said something that stuck with me. Something opened it. That's all I know for certain. The distinction felt important. I pushed further, asking about Riker's condition when he was found. Reginald hadn't been present for the discovery, but he'd spoken to the search team members who were. They said he looked cold, but not hypothermic, Reginald recalled. Which doesn't make sense, does it? 2 nights in the 40s with rain? A child that small should have been in serious trouble, but his core temperature was apparently fine, like something kept him warm. The shed itself. That shed has gaps in the walls you could stick your finger through. It's not insulated. It barely keeps the rain out. I thanked Reginald for his time and moved on to my next source, but his words echoed in my mind. Something opened it. Something kept him warm. Not someone. Something. My next breakthrough came through a Freedom of Information Act request I'd filed months earlier. The search and rescue logs finally arrived, heavily redacted but still revealing. Most of it was standard documentation. Team assignments, search grid coordinates, timing of various sweeps through the forest. But scattered throughout were observations that painted a very different picture than the official narrative. June 4, 11:23 a.m. Thermal anomaly detected on ridge approximately 1.3 miles northeast of last known position. Negative on visual confirmation. Signature disappeared before ground team arrival. June 4, 2:47 p.m. Multiple thermal signatures appear and disappear rapidly in Sector 7. Equipment malfunction suspected but unconfirmed. Signatures do not match known wildlife patterns. June 4, 7:15 p.m. Team 3 reports audible childlike vocalization from unreachable location. Cliff face prevents access. Vocalization ceased before climbing equipment deployed. And then, the entry that made my hand shake when I read it. June 4, 9:03 p.m. Eyes in the tree line. Size inconsistent with known wildlife. Recommend daylight follow-up. Location marked. This entry was written by a volunteer firefighter named Marcus Tully. I tracked him down to a bar in Libby, about 30 miles south of Troy. He refused to talk to me at first, literally walked away when I introduced myself and mentioned Riker's case. It took 3 visits, and finally buying him dinner before we'd even acknowledge being on the search team. I don't talk about that night, he said, pushing food around his plate. I was told not to talk about that night. Told by who? He looked up at me, and I saw genuine fear in his eyes. People who made it clear my cooperation was appreciated and my silence was expected. What did you see, Marcus? He was quiet for a long time, then so softly I almost missed it. Something watching us. Something big enough that the eyes were level with mine and I'm 6 feet tall. But it was crouched in the brush, I could tell by the angle. If it stood up. He didn't finish the sentence, he didn't need to. Did you tell the search coordinators? I logged it. You've seen the log, so you know I logged it. They told me it was probably a bear standing on its hind legs. But I've seen bears, miss. I've seen them up close. That wasn't a bear. What was it? I don't know, he said, meeting my eyes. And I don't want to know. I've got a family. I've got a life here. Some questions aren't worth asking. I had one more question for him, though. The helicopter footage, I said. The FLIR imaging from the air search. Have you seen it? His expression darkened. It doesn't exist. Officially. But unofficially? Unofficially, the pilot saw something he wasn't supposed to see. Unofficially, that footage was classified faster than you can blink. Officially, there was a malfunction, and no usable imagery was captured. I managed to track down the pilot. a man named Sam Keller, who worked for a private helicopter service contracted by the county. He was even more reluctant to talk than Marcus, but I caught him at the right moment after a few drinks at a hangar party when his guard was down. "I saw something moving behind that kid," he told me, words slightly slurred. In the thermal image, clear as day, something big crouched down like it was, I don't know, hiding, protecting him. The shape was wrong for a person, too tall, too thin. But it was there, right behind where we found him the next morning. What happened to the footage? 2 guys in suits showed up at my office 6 hours after the search ended. Didn't identify themselves, just said the footage was part of an ongoing investigation, and they were confiscating the storage drives. I never saw them again, never got the drives back. When I asked the county about it, they told me there was no record of any confiscation. As far as they're concerned, the footage never existed. He looked at me with bloodshot eyes, but I know what I saw, and I know it wasn't nothing. Act 3. Local legends, local fear. The Kootenai tribe has lived in this region for thousands of years, long before Montana was Montana, long before white settlers arrived with their maps and mining claims. Their reservation isn't far from Troy, and I'd heard rumours that some of the tribal elders had knowledge about the forest that went beyond simple folklore. It took time to build trust, to find someone willing to talk to an outsider about sensitive subjects. But eventually, through a contact at the Tribal Cultural Centre, I was introduced to an elder named Joseph Running Bear. We met at his home, a modest house surrounded by pines, where he served me tea and studied me with eyes that seemed to see more than I was comfortable with. "You're asking about the Webb boy," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes, Mr. Running Bear. I'm trying to understand what happened to him." He nodded slowly. "The forest near Troy has been different. For as long as our people have memory, we have stories about that place. Old stories." "What kind of stories?" "Stories about the mimics, the lost ones, the things that live in the deep woods and sometimes take interest in humans, especially children." He poured more tea, taking his time, choosing his words carefully. "Our legends speak of beings that can imitate human voices, especially the voices of children. They call out in the dark, leading people astray. But sometimes, rarely, they do the opposite. Sometimes they protect. Protect who? The innocent, the vulnerable, children who wander into their territory. I felt a chill run through me despite the warm tea. "Why would they do that?" Joseph shrugged. "The stories don't explain their motivations. Maybe they're lonely. Maybe they remember being human once if they ever were. Maybe they operate on logic we can't understand. But the pattern is consistent. Some who go missing in those woods return, and some who return are not quite the same." "Not the same how?" He looked at me for a long moment before answering. "They come back changed. Sometimes physically, sometimes in behaviour, sometimes in ways harder to define. Like they've seen something, experienced something, that fundamentally altered them. The eyes are usually what people notice first. The eyes look older. My hands were shaking. I set down the teacup. Has this happened before? With other children?" "I cannot speak to specific cases," he said carefully, "but I can tell you that the area around Bull Lake Road and Pine Ridge Road has a history. Our people avoided certain parts of that forest traditionally. We marked them as places where the boundary between worlds is thin." After leaving Joseph's home, I went to the Lincoln County Courthouse and started digging through old records, missing persons cases going back decades. What I found was disturbing in its consistency. 7 missing child cases since 1960, all within a 2-mile radius of Pine Ridge Road. 3 found alive, all with memory gaps, all describing similar experiences. Darkness, cold, then warmth, a presence that felt protective rather than threatening, and finally being led or carried to a place where humans could find them. The other 4 were never found. The 3 survivors all exhibited behavioural changes after their return: withdrawal, night terrors, unusual maturity for their age. In each case, the official explanation was trauma from being lost in the wilderness. But reading between the lines, reviewing old police reports and newspaper articles, I could see the pattern Joseph had described. Something in that forest takes an interest in lost children. Sometimes it returns them, but they come back different. I managed to track down a woman who taught at Riker's preschool, though she insisted on anonymity. We met at a coffee shop in Kalispell, far enough from Troy that she felt safe talking. He changed after he came back, she told me, stirring her coffee nervously. I mean, you'd expect some trauma response, right? A child going through something that frightening. But it was more than that. How so? He was more withdrawn, yes. The night terrors were bad, according to his parents, but there was also this maturity. Like he'd suddenly understood things he shouldn't understand at 3 years old. The way he'd look at you sometimes, it was like being evaluated by an adult in a child's body. She leaned closer, lowering her voice. He kept talking about the other boy. Said the other boy was nice, that the other boy kept him warm, that the other boy told him stories. Did his parents mention this? They told me he was just processing the trauma through imagination, creating an imaginary friend to cope with being alone, but what? One day, about a month after he came back, he was drawing in class. I looked over his shoulder and saw he'd drawn 2 figures. When I asked him who they were, he said, me and him. I asked who him was, and he looked at me like I was stupid. He said, the other boy. He said he'd stay in the woods so I could come home. He said it was a fair trade. She wrapped her hands around her coffee mug. I mentioned it in a report to the school counsellor. 2 days later, I was called into the principal's office with a county official I'd never met. They told me that spreading rumours about the Webb case was harmful to the family and potentially actionable. They strongly suggested I focus on Riker's present well-being and stop dwelling on his statements about the experience. They threatened you. They didn't have to threaten explicitly. The message was clear. Stop talking about this, or there will be consequences. Act 4. The eyewitness who breaks the case. For months, I'd been trying to find someone from the original search team willing to go on record with details that contradicted the official story. Most refused outright. Others simply stopped returning my calls. The culture of silence around the Webb case was ironclad. Then I got a call from a number I didn't recognise. The voice on the other end was elderly, male, hesitant. Miss Ferguson, my name is Benjamin Hartley. I understand you've been investigating what happened to the Webb boy. I think we should talk. We met at his home outside Troy, a small ranch house with a view of the Cabinet Mountains. Benjamin was in his late 60s, a retired contractor who'd volunteered with search and rescue teams for over 30 years. I was there, he said simply, once we'd settled in his living room. I was on the team that found him. My heart rate picked up. Can you tell me what you saw? He pulled out a folder, old and worn, and handed it to me. These are copies I made before I turned in my official report. I knew even then that something wasn't right about how the whole thing was being handled. Inside were photographs, notes, sketches, evidence that had never made it into the public record. We found footprints, Benjamin said, pointing to one of the photos, next to where Riker had been. Small footprints consistent with a child his size, but there were others. The photograph showed depressions in the mud near the shed. Alongside the small prints were larger ones, much larger, and they were barefoot. Human? I asked. Shaped like human feet, Benjamin corrected, but the proportions were wrong. Too long, too narrow, and the stride length suggested something tall. Very tall. How tall? Based on them spacing, I'd estimate 7 feet, maybe more. He showed me another photograph, this one showing drag marks in the dirt. These led to the shed. Short marks like something was being carried. The spacing and depth suggested significant weight. More than a 3-year-old child. Like whatever was carrying him was heavy enough to sink deeper into the ground. Could it have been an animal? A bear? Benjamin shook his head. I've tracked animals my whole life. These weren't animal prints. And there were these other impressions. He pointed to circular marks in another photograph. He couldn't figure out what made these. They were too regular to be natural, too random to be man-made. One of the guys on my team said they looked like a deer standing on its hind legs might make, but that's absurd. What did the sheriff's office say? They told us to exclude the unusual prints from our official report, said it would confuse the investigation and distract from the main goal of finding Riker safe. When I pointed out that Riker had already been found, they changed their reasoning, said it would traumatise the family to know something else had been near their son, said we should focus on the positive outcome and not create unnecessary fear. He leaned back, looking tired. But here's the thing that really bothered me. When we actually found Riker, when we approached the shed, the door was standing wide open, not just unlocked, open, like something had just left. Did you see anything? No, but I felt it. We all felt it. Something watching us from the tree line. Something that disappeared the moment we got close to the boy. Benjamin reached into his pocket and pulled out a small digital recorder. I recorded part of the search team briefing that morning. I wasn't supposed to, but I had a feeling things were about to get strange. I was right. He played the recording for me. The audio quality was poor, but I could make out voices discussing the search plan. Then clearly a deputy's voice. We are classifying the unidentified presence as environmental. Do not report visual details in your statements. Keep your descriptions limited to the child's condition and location. Another voice, one I didn't recognise. Higher authorities have already been contacted. They'll handle the anomalous elements. Your job is to stick to the facts. The simple facts. I looked at Benjamin. Higher authorities? No one ever identified who they were, but 2 unmarked vehicles showed up that afternoon. Federal plates. The men inside asked to review all our documentation. They were particularly interested in the photographs of the footprints and the thermal imaging data. What did they look like? Professional, clean cut, the kind of people who are used to having authority and not explaining it. One of them, the one in the green jacket, interviewed several of us separately. He asked strange questions. Like what? He wanted to know if Riker had spoken to it. His exact word, it. Not who, not what, just it. He asked if the boy seemed older somehow, if he looked like himself. At the time, I thought the questions were bizarre. Now, he trailed off, looking out the window at the mountains. Now I think he knew exactly what we'd found, and he was checking to see if Riker had been changed by whatever was out there with him. Act 5. The conspiracy deepens. The more I investigated, the more layers I uncovered. What had started as a simple question about a missing child had evolved into something far more complex and disturbing. Through various sources, I'd learned that several agencies had been present during and immediately after Riker's rescue. The obvious ones were expected. Local search and rescue, Lincoln County Sheriff's deputies, Montana Fish, wildlife, and parks officers. But there were others. 2 unmarked federal vehicles had arrived the afternoon of June 5. No one could tell me which agency they represented. The men inside carried no visible identification, but had authority that local law enforcement immediately deferred to. One witness, a volunteer who'd been helping coordinate the search from a command post, told me the man in the green jacket had arrived with very specific questions that suggested prior knowledge. He knew there would be unusual elements before anyone told him, the witness said. He arrived asking about them, not whether they existed, but what they were specifically, like he'd been briefed in advance. The questions this man asked were telling. Did the boy speak to it? Did he seem older when you found him? Did he look like himself? Were there any physical changes you noticed? That last question bothered me most. Physical changes. As if such things were expected, anticipated even. Through a contact in the medical community who insisted on absolute anonymity, I learned something that chilled me to the bone. Riker's medical evaluation at the hospital showed anomalies. His cortisol levels were elevated far beyond what trauma alone would explain, suggesting exposure to extreme prolonged stress. But more significantly, the blood work showed cellular activity that the attending physician flagged as unusual. Unusual how? I'd asked. Like accelerated cellular turnover. like his body had aged more than 2 days at a cellular level. The doctor wanted to run additional tests, but before she could, someone from administration came down and seized all the samples and paperwork. They said there had been a filing error and the tests needed to be redone at a different facility. Were they redone? Not as far as I know. The whole incident was classified as a clerical mistake and expunged from the record. But the doctor who initially examined him? She left the hospital 3 months later, moved out of state. When I asked her about it at her going-away party, she just said some questions weren't worth the answers. There was another detail that kept nagging at me, something so seemingly impossible I almost discarded it entirely. But journalism is about following the evidence, even when it leads somewhere uncomfortable. When search teams initially interviewed Riker about how he survived, his answers were inconsistent with the official narrative. According to multiple sources who were present but refused to go on record, Riker repeatedly mentioned the quiet boy. He said the quiet boy kept him warm. The quiet boy told him not to be scared. The quiet boy brought him to the shed where people could find him. The quiet boy said it was okay to go home now. Search teams scoured the area for any sign of another child. They found nothing. No footprints that matched a second child. No evidence anyone else had been in the shed. No missing persons reports for children in the region. The quiet boy didn't exist, except Riker insisted he did, and the details he provided were too consistent, too specific to be simple imagination. He described the quiet boy as tall like Daddy, and cold to touch, and didn't talk with his mouth. When pressed on what that last part meant, Riker apparently said the quiet boy talked in the quiet place, touching his own head. Telepathy. The child was describing telepathy. This detail was quickly dismissed as imagination by officials, but it was logged. Someone wrote it down. Someone thought it was significant enough to document before the sanitization of the official record. Ast 6. Return to Pine Ridge Road. A year after Riker disappeared, I returned to Pine Ridge Road with camera equipment and a thermal imaging device borrowed from a friend in wildlife research. I wanted to see the site for myself, to walk the ground where something impossible had occurred. The shed was still there, more weathered now, door hanging loosely on rusted hinges. I approached carefully, documenting everything with my camera. The interior was exactly as Benjamin had described. Empty, dilapidated, gaps in the walls large enough to see through. No insulation, no supplies. Nothing that would help a small child survive 2 nights of cold and rain. I was about to leave when I noticed something in the dirt floor near the back wall. Fresh tracks, recent tracks. I knelt down, examining them carefully. A footprint. Larger than a child's, smaller than an adult's, barefoot. The proportions were wrong, elongated, just like in Benjamin's photographs. My hands were shaking as I took pictures. This print couldn't be more than a few days old, maybe a week at most. The edges were too clean, the definition too sharp. Something had been here recently. I expanded my search, circling the shed, looking for more evidence. Under a rock about 20 feet from the structure, I found something that made my blood freeze. A drawing. A child's drawing, done in crayon on what looked like paper from a fast food restaurant placemat. The crayon and paper were faded but still recognisable. The drawing showed 2 figures. One was small, clearly meant to be a child, labelled me in shaky letters. The other was taller, much taller, with elongated limbs and large dark eyes. It was labelled him. The proportions of the tall figure were disturbing. The arms reached past the knees. The fingers were too long. The eyes were solid black, taking up too much of the face. This was Riker's drawing. It had to be. The style matched what a 3-year-old could produce. But how did it get here? Had his parents brought him back to the site? Had he left it here himself during some return visit? Or had something else placed it here, preserved under a rock, waiting to be found? I pocketed the drawing and continued my investigation as the sun began to set. I'd planned to leave before dark, but something compelled me to stay. Call it journalistic dedication or morbid curiosity. I wanted to experience the sight the way Riker had experienced it. At night, alone, vulnerable. I set up my thermal camera on a tripod, pointing it at the tree line, and settled in for a long night. Act 7. The thing that watches. Around midnight, the forest changed. I can't explain exactly how. The ambient noise didn't stop, the temperature didn't drop dramatically, there was no obvious shift in the environment. But something changed. The quality of the darkness felt different, heavier, more attentive. Then I heard it. A child laughing. High and clear and completely out of place in the deep woods after midnight. I grabbed my flashlight and pointed it toward the sound, but saw nothing. The laughter continued, moving through the trees with impossible speed, first to my left, then to my right, then behind me. My rational mind screamed that it was an animal, a fox or a bird, something with a call that mimicked human sounds. But my instinct knew better. This was laughter. Human laughter. A child's laughter. Then it spoke. "Hello?" A child's voice. Riker's voice. I recognised it from news footage I'd watched dozens of times. But Riker was miles away, safe at home with his parents. "Hello? Are you lost?" The voice was getting closer. I fumbled with my thermal camera, pulling up the display screen with trembling hands. 2 heat signatures appeared in the image. One was child-sized, standing about 30 yards into the tree line. The other was larger, much larger, crouched behind the first. The proportions were wrong. The limbs too long, the torso too narrow, the head too large. I watched, frozen, as the smaller signature moved toward me. The larger one stayed back, unmoving, just watching. "Are you lost?" the child's voice asked again, now close enough that it should have been visible even in the darkness. But I saw nothing with my eyes. Only the thermal camera showed the approaching heat signature. When it was about 15 feet away, it stopped. The larger signature behind it shifted, rising slightly as if preparing to move. Then both vanished. Not gradually, not walking away, just gone, as if they'd been switched off. I sat there in the darkness for another hour, shaking, watching the thermal display for any sign of their return. Nothing. The forest was empty. At dawn, I packed up my equipment and examined the area where the signatures had been. The ground was soft from recent rain. There should have been footprints if something physical had been there. There were. Small barefoot prints, child-sized, and larger ones behind them, the same elongated proportions as the print I'd found in the shed. They led deeper into the forest, toward the ridge where search teams had reported thermal anomalies during Riker's disappearance. I followed them for about 100 yards before they simply ended at the base of a large cedar tree. Not faded, not obscured, just ended, as if whatever made them had ceased to exist at that exact spot. Conclusion. What came back? I spent another 2 months investigating, interviewing more witnesses, filing more records requests, trying to build a coherent picture of what happened in those woods. The truth, as best as I can determine it, is this. Riker Webb wandered into the forest on June 3, 2022. Something found him there. Something old. Something that lives in the places humans rarely go. Something that operates on logic we don't understand. This something kept him alive. Protected him from the cold, the rain, the predators. Led him to a structure where humans would eventually find him. And then, when rescuers arrived, it disappeared back into the wilderness. But protection came with a price. Riker returned physically unharmed but fundamentally changed. His eyes looked older because he'd seen something humans aren't meant to see. His behaviour changed because he'd experienced something children shouldn't experience. His memory gaps exist because some knowledge is too dangerous to retain consciously. The government knew about this. Maybe not specifically, maybe not in advance, but they had protocols in place. They arrived quickly, they seized evidence, they suppressed unusual details, they intimidated witnesses into silence. Which suggests this has happened before, The pattern of missing children in that area going back decades, the tribal legends about the mimics and the lost ones, the federal response that was too coordinated to be improvised. Something lives in those woods near Troy, Montana. Something that occasionally takes an interest in lost children. Sometimes it returns them, but they always come back different. The official story says Riker Webb survived alone through luck and the resilience of children. The official story is a lie. A necessary lie, perhaps, because the truth would raise too many questions, create too much panic, fundamentally challenge our understanding of what shares this world with us. But the truth remains, hidden in redacted documents and suppressed testimonies, and the haunted eyes of a child who spent 2 nights in the presence of something impossible. Riker Webb didn't survive alone. Something helped him. Something the forest keeps hidden. Something that watches, even now, from the tree line. Something that returns children, but not always the same. I returned to the site one final time before leaving Montana. I stood at the edge of the forest, looking into the shadows between the trees, and I felt it watching me. Not threatening, not hostile, just observing, deciding, perhaps, if I was worth engaging with. I left the drawing I'd found under the same rock where I'd discovered it. I don't know why. It felt like the right thing to do, like returning something to its rightful owner. As I drove away, I glanced in my rearview mirror. At the tree line, barely visible in the fading light, stood a figure. Too tall, too thin, too still to be human. It raised one elongated hand in what might have been a wave. Then it stepped back into the shadows and was gone. I haven't been back to Troy since. But sometimes, late at night, when the world is quiet and the boundary between possible and impossible feels thin, I think about Riker Webb. I wonder what he remembers from those 2 days. I wonder what he was told by the quiet boy who kept him warm. I wonder what fair trade was made in that dark forest. And I wonder if, someday, something will come to collect. This has been the story of the 2 days Riker can't remember. Or perhaps, the 2 days he's not allowed to remember. The truth remains out there, in the woods near Troy, in the places humans rarely venture, in the shadows between the trees. Some mysteries are solved, some are buried, and some, like this one, simply wait in the darkness, patient and timeless, for the next lost child to wander into territory that was never really ours to begin with. Thank you for listening. Stay safe out there. And if you ever find yourself lost in the deep woods and something offers to help you find your way home, remember Riker's story before you accept, because protection always comes with a price. And sometimes the cost isn't paid until long after you think you've made it home safely. Good night.